I am Monica, 33 years old, and my husband rushed his mistress's child into the emergency room ahead of ours, while our son convulsed from a fever in my arms. He deliberately used his hospital executive badge to secure the only available trauma bay for her son's mildly sprained ankle, leaving his own flesh and blood to seize in a crowded hallway. The next day, he came racing back to beg our son for forgiveness, but the chief of medicine simply looked at him and said, "You are too late." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who completely underestimated your worth. The fluorescent lights of the emergency room buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pale glow over the absolute chaos unfolding around me. The blaring sirens of arriving ambulances barely registered over the sound of my own desperate pleading. My 6-year-old son Leo was convulsing violently in my arms. His skin radiated heat, burning with a 104-degree fever that had spiked out of nowhere just 30 minutes earlier. I clutched his small, thrashing body to my chest, screaming for a doctor, a nurse, anyone to help us. The waiting room was packed shoulder to shoulder with groaning patients, and the triage desk was a wall of frantic activity. Just as a nurse finally grabbed a crash cart and started rushing toward us, the heavy automatic sliding doors of the emergency department burst wide open. I looked up, relief flooding my chest for a fraction of a second, when I saw my husband Bradley sprinting through the entrance. But that relief instantly turned to ice. Bradley was not running toward us. He was not looking at Leo. He was carrying a 7-year-old boy named Toby, who was softly whining about a sore foot. Trailing right behind Bradley, dabbing at perfectly dry eyes with a tissue, was Amber. She was a 26-year-old woman Bradley claimed was just a junior marketing consultant he was mentoring. Right then, as my husband used his broad shoulders to push past bleeding patients, the truth of their relationship hit me with sickening clarity. "Clear the way!" Bradley bellowed, his voice echoing off the linoleum walls with the practiced arrogance of a hospital executive. He reached into his tailored suit jacket, pulled out his silver Vice President of Operations badge, and shoved it into the face of the nearest triage nurse. "I need VIP Trauma Bay 1 prepped right now. We have a pediatric emergency, possible severe ankle sprain." The nurse, a young woman looking utterly exhausted, glanced from Bradley's badge to where I was kneeling on the floor with Leo, whose seizures were growing more erratic. "Sir, we have a code yellow seizing child right here who needs that bay," she stammered, pointing frantically at my son. I scrambled to my feet, my arms wrapped securely around Leo to keep his head from hitting the hard floor, and lunged toward my husband. "Bradley," I screamed, my voice raw and cracking. "Bradley, look at him. Leo is seizing. His fever is 104. We need a doctor immediately." Bradley stopped, annoyance flashing across his handsome face. He looked down at our son, his own flesh and blood shaking uncontrollably in my arms, and then rolled his eyes. He actually rolled his eyes. "Stop being a hysterical hypochondriac, Monica," he sneered, keeping his grip tight around Amber's son. "It is just a childhood fever. Give him some Tylenol and wait your turn like everyone else." "He is having a febrile seizure," I sobbed, stepping directly into his path to block him from moving toward the sterile double doors of the VIP wing. "He needs oxygen. He needs the trauma bay. You cannot do this." Amber stepped forward, her hand resting possessively on Bradley's arm. She looked me up and down with an expression of pure disgust. "Listen to your husband, Monica," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Brad told me all about your little stay-at-home data entry job. You have zero medical training. Stop embarrassing him in his own hospital and let him handle a real emergency. Toby is in agonizing pain." I stared at her, then back at the man I had been married to for 7 years. The man whose entire lavish lifestyle, from his imported cars to his expensive watches, was secretly funded by that very same data entry job he so deeply despised. He truly believed I was just a low-level freelancer who spent her days managing spreadsheets in sweatpants. He had no idea he was speaking to the founder and CEO of Apex Health Systems, the very tech corporation that controlled this entire hospital's database. But right now, I was not a CEO. I was a terrified mother watching her child slip away. Bradley, I am begging you. I cried, tears streaming down my face as Leo let out a terrible, choked, gasping sound. He is your son. Bradley shoved me aside with his free hand, his push so forceful I stumbled backward, barely managing to keep my balance and protect Leo's head. I have to deal with a real VIP patient right now, not your stay-at-home mom paranoia. Bradley spat, his tone laced with absolute venom. Do not make me call security to have you removed from my hospital. He turned his back on me, barking orders at the intimidated nursing staff. The young triage nurse looked at me with tears in her own eyes, silently apologizing as Bradley's authority forced her to comply. He carried Amber's crying son through the double doors, demanding ice packs and priority orthopedic consults for a mildly twisted ankle. I was left standing in the crowded, chaotic hallway, the harsh fluorescent lights glaring down on us. The noise of the waiting room swelled back up, a cacophony of coughing, crying, and medical alarms. I looked down at Leo. His small chest hitched violently. His skin had turned a terrifying shade of pale, and his lips were beginning to take on a bluish tint. Suddenly, Leo's entire body went rigid. The violent shaking stopped, replaced by a horrifying stillness. His eyes rolled back into his head, showing only the whites, and he went completely limp in my arms. The heavy, dead weight of my little boy sent a shockwave of pure adrenaline and primal terror straight through my veins. I looked toward the VIP suite doors. I could see Bradley through the small glass window settling Amber onto a plush leather sofa, handing her a bottle of water, completely ignoring the fact that he had just left his own child to die in a hallway. The lock on the VIP door clicked shut with a sharp, heavy sound that echoed in my mind like a gunshot. He had made his choice. A piercing alarm shattered the momentary silence of the corridor as the triage nurse slammed her palm against the code yellow button on the wall. The terrifying dead weight of Leo in my arms sent a shockwave of primal panic through my entire body. Within seconds, a swarm of medical staff descended upon us. A tall emergency room physician, Dr. Evans, practically slid across the linoleum, snatching my son from my grasp and laying him flat on an approaching gurney. "Get him on oxygen immediately!" Dr. Evans shouted over the din of the crowded emergency room. "His temperature is critical and he is completely unresponsive. We need a pediatric intensive care unit bed prepped right now. Move him." I sprinted alongside the gurney as they rushed Leo down the chaotic hallway, my hands covered in cold sweat. We skidded to a halt outside the heavy doors of the trauma center. A young intake receptionist named Sarah was frantically typing at her rolling computer station, trying to log Leo into the hospital's central database to authorize the emergency ICU transfer. "I need an overriding approval for a PICU transfer," Dr. Evans ordered, adjusting the oxygen mask over Leo's pale face. "Run his primary insurance profile." Sarah typed furiously, her eyes darting between the screen and my son. Suddenly, an aggressive red error box flashed across her monitor. She froze, her face draining of color. "Doctor, the system will not let me admit him," Sarah stammered, her voice shaking with panic. "His insurance profile is completely locked." "What do you mean it is locked?" I demanded, stepping forward and gripping the edge of the rolling desk. "We have the premium executive family plan. Bradley is the vice president of operations. Override the error." "I am trying," Sarah whispered, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "But the system shows a manual diversion. VP Bradley just authorized an emergency reallocation of your entire family policy limit. He used your dependent coverage to force open a VIP concierge account for an uninsured minor named Toby. The system automatically froze all other family members to clear the billing for the VIP suite. The sheer, calculated cruelty of the administrative move hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Bradley had not just abandoned his seizing son in a hallway. He had weaponized his executive power to hijack Leo's medical coverage, ensuring his mistress's child received premium out-of-network concierge care for a sprained ankle, all while leaving his own flesh and blood locked out of the critical care system. "We do not have time for administrative red tape," Dr. Evans snapped his hands, working desperately to stabilize Leo's erratic pulse. "We need that ICU bed now. The boy is crashing. I cannot assign a bed without a cleared intake protocol." Sarah cried out, terrified of breaking hospital policy. "The VP override requires a counter-authorization from the hospital board. I am locked out." Before I could tear the keyboard away from her and manually bypass the firewalls myself, the frosted glass doors of the VIP suite hissed open. Amber casually strolled out into the chaotic hallway holding a designer leather handbag. She let out a loud theatrical sigh, complaining to a passing orderly that the VIP suite did not have her preferred brand of almond milk for her coffee. As she reached up to impatiently tuck a strand of blonde hair behind her ear, the harsh fluorescent lights of the corridor caught the heavy sparkle of diamonds on her wrist. I stopped breathing. The world around me seemed to mute into absolute silence. Wrapped around Amber's wrist was a custom platinum diamond tennis bracelet featuring a very distinct vintage emerald clasp. It was Brenda's bracelet. My mother-in-law had claimed she lost that exact priceless family heirloom at the country club last Christmas. I vividly remembered spending 3 grueling hours in the freezing sleet searching the dark driveway on my hands and knees, while Brenda sat inside sobbing about losing a sacred piece of family history. Bradley had scolded me for days for being careless enough to not keep a closer eye on his mother's belongings. And here it was gleaming brightly on the wrist of Bradley's mistress. Amber noticed me staring at the jewelry. A nasty, triumphant smirk spread across her face. She deliberately extended her arm, admiring the diamonds under the hospital lights. "Brenda has such lovely taste," Amber said, her voice carrying easily over the noise of the medical monitors. She told Brad it would look so much better on someone with actual elegance. "Do not worry about the hospital bill out here in the pauper hallway, Monica. Brad says he moved some numbers around in the system so Toby gets the absolute best care. He always takes care of his real priorities." The profound, sickening betrayal clicked into place with absolute perfection. This was not just a hidden affair. The entire family knew. Brenda and Richard had funded this, celebrated it, and actively participated in my humiliation. They had watched me search in the freezing rain for a bracelet they had already handed over to the woman sleeping with my husband. They had sat at my dining table eating the meals I cooked, while laughing behind my back at the pathetic, oblivious wife who thought she was part of their family. A strange, freezing calm washed over me. The desperate, weeping mother who had been begging for help just seconds ago vanished completely. The panic evaporated, replaced by the cold, calculating precision of the apex predator I truly was. Bradley thought I was just a low-level data entry clerk who did freelance work from the kitchen table. He thought the hospital database was an untouchable fortress that he commanded. He had absolutely no idea that I wrote the source code he was currently using to block my son's medical care. I looked at Sarah, who was near tears, as she frantically clicked her mouse, apologizing over and over that there was no way to bypass a vice president's override in the Apex Health database. "Step back from the console, Sarah," I said, my voice eerily steady and completely devoid of emotion. I reached into the pocket of my coat and pulled out my phone. I bypassed the standard hospital directory and dialed a highly secure unlisted internal number. The line picked up on the first ring. "Dr. Mitchell, activate Protocol 0. Transfer my son to the executive penthouse immediately and sever VP Bradley's server access." The next morning, the sun rose over the Boston skyline, casting long shadows across the hospital parking garage. Bradley pulled his luxury sedan into his reserved spot, stepping out with the relaxed swagger of a man who believed he held the world in the palm of his hand. He smoothed his tailored suit jacket and grabbed a cheap foil get-well balloon from the back seat. His parents, Brenda and Richard, were flying in this afternoon, and he needed to put on his best performance as the concerned, perfect father. He fully expected to stroll into the pediatric ward and find me crying over a standard hospital bed, easily manipulated and desperate for his attention. He swaggered through the main lobby, flashing his charming smile at the receptionist, entirely oblivious to the shifting dynamics around him. He made his way to the pediatric intensive care unit, expecting the staff to part for him like the Red Sea. Instead, he found his path completely blocked by Dr. Mitchell, the chief of medicine. Dr. Mitchell stood squarely in the center of the corridor, his arms crossed over his white coat, flanked by two imposing security guards. "Morning," Mitchell Bradley said breezily, attempting to push past him. "Which room did they stuff Leo in? I need to make an appearance before my parents get here. Monica is probably having a total meltdown by now." Dr. Mitchell did not move a single inch. "You are not going anywhere near that ward, Bradley." Bradley scoffed, his fragile ego instantly flaring up at the perceived disrespect. He stepped closer, attempting to use his height to intimidate the older doctor. "I do not think you understand who you are talking to, Mitchell. I am the Vice President of Operations. I sign your paychecks. Now move out of my way before I have HR clear out your office by noon." "You do not sign anything anymore," Dr. Mitchell replied, his voice laced with absolute disgust. Bradley sneered, reaching into his pocket and aggressively pulling out his silver executive badge. He slammed it against the security scanner on the double doors behind Dr. Mitchell. He expected the familiar green light and the satisfying click of the heavy locks releasing. Instead, the scanner flashed a harsh, violent red. A loud buzz echoed through the hallway. The digital display screen above the door blinked with a single undeniable message: "Access denied." Bradley froze, his confident smirk faltering as he slammed the badge against the reader a second time. Then a third time. The red light flashed relentlessly, mocking his sudden panic. He turned back to the chief of medicine, his face reddening with a mixture of confusion and rage. "What is wrong with this system? Fix it right now. I demand to see my son." Dr. Mitchell stared him down, his expression completely devoid of sympathy. "You are too late, Bradley. The boy was airlifted to the Apex Medical Penthouse hours ago. And your badge, it has been deactivated." The elevator doors glided open, depositing me back into the sensory assault of the main hospital lobby. The sterile air smelled of bleach and stale coffee, a stark contrast to the immaculate, silent corridors of the Apex Medical Penthouse upstairs. I had only come down to the main floor to retrieve Leo's discarded jacket and backpack from the general triage area. My heart finally beating at a normal rhythm now that my son was stabilized, resting under the care of the city's top pediatric specialists. As I crossed the crowded atrium, a shrill, grating voice sliced through the ambient noise of the waiting room. It was Amber. She was leaning aggressively over the main billing counter, tapping her French manicured fingernails against the plexiglass partition. Toby sat slouched in a rigid plastic chair nearby, swinging his mildly sprained foot and loudly demanding a tablet to play games on. "Read the screen again," Amber shrieked at the exhausted billing clerk. "I am Vice President Bradley's guest. We were in the VIP trauma suite 10 minutes ago. You do not just kick us out and hand me a bill for a standard emergency consult." "Ma'am, as I have explained 3 times," the clerk replied, her voice strained but professional. "The executive override on this account was reversed by the chief of medicine. Your insurance is out of network for this facility. We require a $4,000 deposit before scheduling the orthopedic specialist for your son." Amber let out a theatrical gasp of indignation, violently digging through her designer purse while muttering about getting people fired. Before I could turn away from the pathetic display, the heavy revolving doors at the hospital entrance spun wildly. Brenda and Richard swept into the lobby. My mother-in-law was draped in a suffocating layer of cashmere and heavy gold jewelry, looking as though she was arriving at a charity gala rather than an emergency room. Richard trailed a few steps behind her, aggressively barking stock market commands into his Bluetooth earpiece, completely disconnected from the reality of the hospital around him. They did not scan the room for me. They did not rush to the pediatric desk to ask if their grandson Leo had survived the night. Instead, Brenda made a direct, calculated beeline straight for Amber. "Amber, darling, what is this nonsense?" Brenda cooed, wrapping her arms around her son's mistress in a display of sickening familiarity. Amber immediately adopted a victimized pout. "Brenda, it is a nightmare. Some horrible doctor kicked poor Toby out of his recovery suite, and now they are demanding my credit card. Brad promised everything was taken care of. It is simply an administrative glitch, Brenda assured her, patting Amber's back as if soothing a distressed child. Richard will have the hospital board fire whoever caused this inconvenience. I stood frozen near the elevator bank, my hands curling into tight fists. The sheer audacity of the scene playing out in front of me was suffocating. They had known. My in-laws had known about the affair, welcomed this woman into their circle, and actively protected Bradley's double life. Brenda turned to beckon Richard over, and as she pivoted, her sharp gaze locked onto me. Her expression morphed instantly from coddling warmth to absolute unadulterated venom. She let go of Amber and marched across the polished tile floor, her high heels clicking like rapid gunfire against the stone. I braced myself, lifting my chin. "You," Brenda hissed, stopping inches from my face. "What kind of pathetic stunt are you pulling now, Monica?" "My son nearly died last night, Brenda," I said, keeping my voice low and terrifyingly calm. "Your son left him convulsing in a hallway to treat a sprained ankle. And you are asking me about a stunt? Do not you dare play the martyr with me!" Brenda spat, her voice rising to draw the attention of the surrounding nurses and patients. "Bradley texted us this morning. He told us you were running around the emergency room screaming like a lunatic, embarrassing him in front of his staff. And now Amber is being harassed by the billing department. This has your petty vindictive fingerprints all over it." "Amber is not my concern," I replied, holding her furious gaze without blinking. "And neither is your son. My only priority is Leo, who is currently recovering from a severe febrile seizure without a single visit from his father or his grandparents." Brenda let out a harsh, barking laugh that echoed through the lobby. She stepped closer, her expensive perfume clashing violently with the sterile hospital air. "You are entirely to blame for this entire situation," Brenda sneered, jabbing a manicured finger hard into my shoulder. "Look at you. You look like a vagrant. If you dressed like a real executive's wife instead of a thrift store data clerk, Bradley would not have to seek comfort elsewhere. You sit at your kitchen table typing on a laptop all day, bringing absolutely zero value to his life or his image. You practically forced him into another woman's arms with your absolute lack of ambition." The sheer delusion of her words was almost dizzying. This woman, whose entire country club lifestyle was currently being propped up by my corporate success, was lecturing me about value. She had spent the last 7 years mocking my quiet late-night coding sessions, entirely unaware that those sessions had built a billion-dollar empire. "Bradley made his own choices," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "And today he is facing the consequences of those choices." Brenda's eyes narrowed into dark, hateful slits. "You ungrateful little nobody!" Without warning, Brenda raised her hand and slapped me across the face. The sharp, stinging crack of her palm against my cheek silenced the entire lobby. A few nurses gasped in shock. A passing orderly dropped a stack of clipboards that clattered loudly against the tiles. My head snapped to the side from the force of the blow, a hot, blooming pain radiating across my skin. I did not fall. I did not cry. I slowly turned my head back to face her, my expression completely deadpan. My eerie calm seemed to infuriate her even more than if I had screamed. "Do not look at me like that," Brenda shrieked, losing whatever remained of her elite composure. She drew her arm back again, her hand curled into a tight claw, preparing to deliver a second, more vicious strike to wipe the defiance off my face. Before her hand could even begin its descent, a large, impeccably tailored arm shot out from the gathering crowd. A strong, unyielding hand clamped shut around Brenda's wrist, stopping her strike dead in midair. The sudden interference caught everyone off guard. Brenda gasped, jerking her arm in a desperate attempt to free herself, but the grip on her wrist was absolute iron. Terrence stood towering over her. He was dressed in a razor-sharp charcoal suit, carrying a sleek leather briefcase in his free hand. His dark eyes were fixed on Brenda, with a look of pure, unadulterated fury. Behind him stood Megan, trembling slightly, but looking at her mother with a newfound, horrified clarity. "Touch my sister-in-law again," Brenda Terrence said, his deep voice carrying a lethal, terrifying calm through the silent hospital lobby. And I will have you arrested for assault before your fake pearls hit the floor. Terrence released Brenda's wrist with a sharp, forceful flick, discarding her arm, as if he had just touched something utterly repulsive. Brenda stumbled backward, her heavy cashmere coat slipping off one shoulder, her face flushed with a mixture of profound shock and rising panic. She clutched her wrist, gasping for air, while Richard finally stopped barking stock orders into his earpiece, his jaw dropping at the sight of his wife being publicly reprimanded. Megan, Terrence's wife and Bradley's sister, stepped out from behind her husband's broad shoulders. She refused to look at her mother, her tear-filled eyes locked onto me with an expression of deep, agonizing apology. "What the hell is going on down here?" The arrogant, booming voice belonged to Bradley. He strode out of the elevator bank, clutching a cheap foil get-well balloon, looking bewildered by the scene unfolding in his pristine hospital lobby. He took in the sight of his mother clutching her wrist, Amber pouting near the billing desk, and Terrence standing like a brick wall between his family and me. "Your mother just tried to strike my sister-in-law," Terrence said, his voice echoing across the sudden quiet of the atrium. "And I am currently debating whether to call the police or simply let hospital security throw her out onto the street." Bradley's face contorted into an ugly sneer. He dropped the foil balloon, letting it drift aimlessly toward the ceiling, and marched toward us. "You need to back off, Terrence. You have absolutely no idea what is going on here. Monica is having a psychotic break. She has been harassing my staff and now she is threatening my mother." Terrence did not yield a single inch. He stepped directly into Bradley's path, forcing my husband to stop, or physically collide with him. The height difference was marginal, but Terrence's commanding presence made Bradley look like a petulant child wearing his father's suit. "The only thing I know," Terrence said, his words sharp and deliberate, "is that your 6-year-old son was rushed into pediatric intensive care last night with a 104-degree fever, suffering from severe febrile seizures. I know this because my wife and I have been sitting in the waiting room since 2 a.m. praying he stabilizes. I also know that you, his father, were actively hiding in a luxury suite upstairs playing nursemaid to your mistress's son over a twisted ankle. You abandoned a seizing child in a hallway, Bradley. You are a disgrace to the very concept of fatherhood." The surrounding crowd of nurses, patients, and billing clerks murmured in collective horror. Several people openly pointed at Bradley. The polished, untouchable facade of the Vice President of Operations was disintegrating in front of a live audience. Bradley's face flushed a deep, mottled purple, his fragile ego entirely dependent on his title and the fear he instilled in his subordinates, shattered under the weight of Terrence's public shaming. He puffed out his chest, his fists clenching at his sides. "Do not you dare lecture me about fatherhood or family loyalty." Bradley spat a vein bulging visibly in his neck. "You are nothing but a diversity hire, Terrence. You only made partner at your law firm because they needed a good brochure photo for their corporate quotas. You sit at our dinner table drinking my father's expensive scotch, pretending you belong in our world. You know absolutely nothing about the pressure of being a real executive. You know nothing about what it takes to protect this family." A collective gasp rippled through the lobby at the sheer, unvarnished bigotry of the remark. Megan let out a choked sob, covering her mouth with her hands. I stepped forward, fury burning hot in my chest, ready to tear Bradley apart. But Terrence remained perfectly, terrifyingly calm. He did not raise his voice. He did not clench his fists. Instead, Terrence casually raised his left arm and slowly adjusted the heavy, solid gold Rolex on his wrist. It was a subtle, deliberate movement, a quiet display of the immense self-made wealth and power he commanded. "Family loyalty," Terrence repeated, tasting the words as if they were poison. "That is an interesting concept for you to bring up, Brad. Let us talk about family loyalty. Let us talk about 3 years ago." Bradley's arrogant sneer faltered. A flash of genuine panic darted across his eyes. "Shut up, Terrence. This is not the time." "Oh, I think it is the perfect time," Terrence continued, his voice projecting effortlessly. "I think we should talk about the night you wrapped a company-leased Mercedes around a concrete light pole at 3 in the morning, completely high on cocaine. Do you remember who you called, Bradley? Because you certainly did not call your father. You called the diversity hire." Brenda let out a strangled shriek, gripping Richard's arm, as if her legs were giving out beneath her. I drove to that precinct at 4 in the morning, Terrence stated, stepping so close to Bradley that my husband was forced to lean backward to maintain his balance. I personally bailed you out. I pulled every legal favor I had to get those charges reduced and sealed. I worked the case pro bono, hiding the paperwork from the press, specifically to save Brenda's precious country club reputation. I protected this family's name while you dragged it through the gutter. And I never told a single soul, not even Monica. So do not stand there in your cheap suit and lecture me about loyalty. You are a pathetic, cowardly little boy pretending to be a man. The absolute silence in the lobby was deafening. Bradley was completely immobilized, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound escaping. The terrifying truth of his hidden DUI, exposed in front of his parents, his mistress, and his entire hospital staff, had stripped him of every defense he possessed. Amber, however, was entirely immune to the gravity of the family destruction happening around her. She stomped her foot against the tile, crossing her arms over her chest in a severe, petulant pout. "Brad, I am so completely over this," Amber whined, her high-pitched voice grating against the heavy silence. "You dragged Toby out of a comfortable bed, some rude doctor kicked us out of our suite, and now these billing people are harassing me for a deposit. I am not standing in this waiting room listening to your family argue. You promised me compensation for dealing with your boring, miserable wife. I want the Porsche you promised me. Order it right now or Toby and I are leaving." Bradley blinked, shaking his head, as if trying to clear a thick fog. He looked at Amber, then at the horrified faces of his parents, and finally at me. He saw an opportunity, a desperate, pathetic chance to regain his alpha status, to prove to everyone in the room that he was still the wealthy, untouchable executive who could fix any problem by throwing money at it. "You want the Porsche?" Bradley barked, his voice dripping with forced bravado. "Fine. I am buying it right now. I will wire the $90,000 deposit straight to the dealership. Let everyone here see exactly how much power I have. Let Monica see what real wealth looks like." He aggressively yanked his smartphone from his jacket pocket. With a smug, triumphant grin directed solely at me, he unlocked the device and aggressively tapped the screen to open his premier banking application. He did not realize that in his frantic, ego-driven haste, he held the phone at an angle that caught the bright overhead hospital lights. The large, high-definition screen reflected perfectly against the dark, polished plexiglass of the billing counter right beside him. The secure banking app loaded, displaying the primary executive joint checking account. The numbers glowed in crisp, bold, undeniable green text. Available balance $0. The glaring green zeros on the reflection of the plexiglass seemed to burn into the retinas of everyone watching. Bradley tapped his phone screen furiously, his thumb jabbing at the refresh icon over and over again. The banking application reloaded, but the agonizing reality remained unchanged. His premium executive account was completely empty. Amber let out a sharp, irritated huff, entirely oblivious to the monumental catastrophe unfolding on that digital display. "Stop playing games with your app." "Brad," she whined, tugging at his tailored sleeve. "Wire the dealership the money. Toby's foot is throbbing, and I want to leave this depressing hospital right now." Bradley ignored her, his eyes wild and bloodshot as he finally looked up from the screen. His gaze locked onto me, and the confusion in his expression rapidly mutated into unhinged, desperate rage. He realized exactly who controlled the digital infrastructure of his life. "What did you do?" Bradley roared, his voice cracking as he shoved his phone back into his pocket. "Where is my money, Monica? Put it back right now." He lunged forward, his hands outstretched as if he intended to grab me by the throat right there in the crowded emergency room lobby. He moved with the blind, reckless momentum of a cornered animal. But he never even made it within arm's reach. Terrence stepped effortlessly into the gap between us. He did not throw a punch, but he planted his broad chest directly in Bradley's path and shoved him back with a forceful, flat-palmed strike to the center of his chest. Bradley stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly against the polished linoleum before he collided heavily with the billing counter. Keep your hands to yourself, Brad. Terrence commanded, his deep voice slicing through the chaotic ambient noise of the room. You are already facing an assault charge from your mother's little stunt. Do not add domestic violence to your rapidly growing list of legal failures today. Get out of my way, Terrence Bradley spat, gripping the edge of the counter to steady himself. That crazy witch just hacked into my personal checking account and stole $90,000. I am calling the police. I am having her arrested for grand larceny. Brenda immediately seized the opportunity to screech from the sidelines, clutching her wrist where Terrence had grabbed her earlier. Do it, Bradley. Call the authorities. Have this pathetic woman dragged out of here in handcuffs. She has always been a scheming, greedy little parasite. She is probably funneling your hard-earned money into some offshore account. I stood perfectly still watching them unravel. I did not need to say a single word. I had brought the absolute best weapon to this fight, and he was currently unlatching his sleek leather briefcase on top of the hospital intake desk. Terrence calmly snapped the brass locks of his briefcase open. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, crisply folded stack of legal paper bound by a heavy blue seal. He held the document up under the harsh fluorescent lights, making sure Bradley got a crystal-clear view of the prominent notary stamp on the front page. You are not calling the police, Bradley Terrence said, a razor-sharp smile spreading across his face. And nobody stole a single dime from you. You simply fell victim to your own monumental arrogance. Does this document look familiar to you? Bradley squinted at the paperwork, his face draining of whatever color it had left. His jaw went entirely slack. Let me refresh your memory, Terrence continued, his voice projecting with the practiced cadence of a seasoned trial lawyer commanding a courtroom. 5 years ago, you received your first big promotion to vice president. You were so incredibly proud of that shiny new salary. You were so terrified that your wife, who you repeatedly claimed was just wasting her time with a failing freelance data entry gig, would become a financial burden on your newfound wealth. You dragged Monica into my law office and aggressively forced her to sign a post-nuptial agreement to protect your precious assets. Megan let out a sharp gasp, staring at her brother with absolute disgust. You forced your own wife to sign a postnup because you got a promotion, Megan asked, her voice shaking with revulsion. He certainly did, Terrence confirmed, never taking his eyes off Bradley, and he explicitly demanded that I draft the most ironclad, impenetrable separation of assets possible. He wanted a legally binding guarantee that Monica could never touch his executive bonuses, his retirement accounts, or his personal investments. He made her sit across from my desk and sign away her rights to his money while mocking her small business ambitions. I knew exactly what I was doing that day in Terrence's office. While Bradley was busy gloating about protecting his low six-figure hospital salary, I was silently securing my absolute undisputed ownership of Apex Health Systems. He was building a picket fence to protect a sandbox, entirely unaware that I was constructing a fortress around a gold mine. That is marital property, Brenda shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. Richard, do something. She cannot just drain a joint account. A post-nup does not cover shared checking balances. Richard, who had finally gone completely silent, stared at the floor. He was a seasoned stockbroker. He already knew exactly where this was going, and the realization was making him physically ill. You are absolutely right, Brenda, Terrence said smoothly, tapping the legal document against his palm. Joint accounts are subject to shared division. But Bradley drained that joint account himself over the last 6 months. He spent thousands on luxury hotel suites, expensive dinners, and a very specific vintage emerald diamond bracelet for his mistress. Every dime of Bradley's actual salary is already gone. Amber let out a strangled gasp, stepping away from the counter and staring at Bradley as if he had just transformed into a rotting corpse. You are broke, she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the walls. You told me you were a millionaire. I am, Bradley stammered, sweat pouring down his forehead. The $90,000 was right there this morning. I saw the transfer hit the account. It is my money. Terrence smiled ruthlessly. It was never your money. The deposit you saw this morning was an automated corporate transfer that temporarily routed through the shared clearing account. It triggered an automatic recall the second your badge was deactivated upstairs. Terence took one step closer to my husband, delivering the final crushing blow with absolute precision. Under your own contract, Bradley, all independent corporate dividends remain separate. That $90,000 you thought was yours. It was Monica's tech dividends. You have exactly $12 to your name. The silence in the lobby stretched into a heavy, suffocating vacuum. Bradley stood completely paralyzed, his thumb hovering uselessly over the smooth glass of his smartphone. The reality of his absolute financial ruin was radiating from the screen, casting a pale, sickly glow across his ashen face. He was trapped in a nightmare entirely of his own making, unable to look away from the glowing green zeros that signaled his total destruction. Amber, however, was completely incapable of reading the room. She snatched the phone from his trembling grip, her long acrylic nails clicking harshly against the screen. She stared at the zero balance, her carefully constructed pout morphing into a contorted mask of furious disbelief. "This is a glitch!" Amber shrieked, shaking the device as if physical force could generate $90,000. "Brad, call your bank right now. Call your wealth manager. You promised me that Porsche today. You promised me a lifestyle upgrade for dealing with this nightmare of a family. You told me the transfer was done." Bradley could not speak. He simply stared at the floor, his entire corporate identity disintegrating into dust. His chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths, but no words came out. Sensing Bradley's sudden, pathetic weakness, Amber decided to take matters into her own hands. She spun around, her eyes scanning the crowd of onlookers until they landed on a tall, distinguished man in a pristine white coat who had just stepped out of the adjacent administrative corridor. It was Dr. Mitchell, the chief of medicine, the man who had personally reversed Bradley's VIP override an hour earlier. Amber recognized his badge of authority immediately and marched straight toward him, her heels striking the polished floor like rapid hammer blows. She threw her shoulders back, attempting to project an aura of absolute superiority. "You," Amber barked, jabbing a manicured finger directly at the chief of medicine's chest. "You are in charge of this facility, right? I want this entire situation handled immediately." "That man," she pointed at Terence, "physically assaulted my future mother-in-law. And that woman," she aggressively waved her hand toward me, "is a deranged, hysterical data clerk who is actively harassing a senior executive. I want them both fired. I want them removed from this hospital right now." Dr. Mitchell did not flinch. He slowly adjusted his glasses, looking down at Amber with an expression of profound clinical disgust. He looked at her as if she were a biological hazard that needed to be contained. "Excuse me?" Dr. Mitchell asked, his voice low and dangerously calm. "You heard me," Amber screamed, throwing her hands in the air. Her shrill voice echoed off the high glass ceilings, drawing even more attention from the upper balconies. "Do you have any idea who I am? I am Bradley's partner. I am the future wife of the Vice President of Operations. Brad runs this hospital, and by extension, he runs you. If you do not have these two escorted out by security this exact second, Brad will strip you of your title and ruin your career." The sheer audacity of her delusion was staggering. She was standing in a room full of highly educated medical professionals attempting to leverage a hollow title to order the termination of a billionaire tech founder and a ruthless corporate lawyer. Dr. Mitchell looked right past Amber, his piercing gaze locking onto Bradley. "Is this woman speaking for you, Bradley? Is this the behavior you endorse in our general triage area?" Bradley remained silent, his eyes wide and terrified. He was a cornered rat stripped of his money, his power, and his dignity. He could not even muster the courage to look his superior in the eye. When Bradley failed to back her up, Amber's frustration boiled over into absolute unhinged rage. She spun around, abandoning the chief of medicine, and directed her fury squarely at Brenda. The older woman was still clutching her wrist, trying to hide behind her husband. "Do something!" "Brenda!" Amber shrieked, her face turning a blotchy, uneven red. "You promised me this transition would be seamless. You promised me that once Monica was out of the picture, Brad and I would step into our rightful place. Tell them who I am. Make them listen to me." Brenda recoiled frantically, waving her hands to silence the younger woman. "Amber, lower your voice right now. People are watching. You are embarrassing us." I do not care who is watching. Amber completely exploded, her arms flailing wildly as she lost all sense of self-preservation. I am done playing the quiet little secret. I have put up with living in that overpriced, tacky apartment downtown for an entire year. Do not stand there pretending you do not know me. You have been secretly paying my $4,000 rent every single month just to hide me from Monica. A collective synchronized gasp echoed through the atrium. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and lethal. The air in the room felt as though it had turned to solid ice. Brenda let out a sharp, choked wheeze, bringing both hands up to cover her mouth. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, taking in the horrified faces of the nursing staff, the billing clerks, and finally her husband. Richard stood frozen, his Bluetooth earpiece falling from his ear and dangling uselessly by its wire against his tailored suit jacket. The blood drained entirely from his face as he stared at his wife. Brenda had been siphoning their marital funds, funneling thousands of dollars a month behind his back, actively financing their son's illicit double life. Her complicity was not just passive approval, it was a heavily funded, calculated conspiracy designed to deceive me and protect Bradley's affair. You said Monica was a useless nobody? Amber continued to rant, completely oblivious to the catastrophic damage her words were inflicting on her so-called allies. You said she brought zero value to the family, and that I was the exact kind of high-class woman Bradley deserved. You paid for my silence, Brenda. You bought my loyalty. And now your son is standing here completely broke. Fix this right now. Brenda swayed on her feet, looking as though she might actually faint. She reached a trembling hand out toward her husband, seeking support. But Richard stepped back, his expression morphing into one of absolute, unadulterated revulsion. He turned his back on her, refusing to catch her as she stumbled silently, disavowing her in front of the entire hospital. Terrence stood beside me, his arms crossed casually over his chest, watching the implosion with grim satisfaction. He leaned slightly toward me, keeping his voice perfectly modulated. I believe that legally constitutes a full, unprompted confession of financial conspiracy in front of 50 reliable witnesses. I did not smile. I did not blink. I simply watched the elite, untouchable Bradley family tear themselves apart from the inside out, destroyed by the very arrogance, greed, and deception they had worshipped for decades. Dr. Mitchell took a slow, deliberate step forward, effectively ending Amber's unhinged monologue. He reached to his belt and unclipped his heavy two-way radio, his eyes fixed firmly on my husband. The clinical detachment in his gaze had vanished, replaced by an ironclad resolve. Bradley, Dr. Mitchell said, his voice echoing with absolute unforgiving authority. 10 minutes ago, our accounting department flagged several highly irregular VIP overrides and unauthorized luxury expenditures routed through your executive credentials. We assumed it was an administrative error. Based on this display and the confessions just aired in my lobby, it is clearly a pattern of gross financial misconduct. Bradley finally found his voice, a pathetic high-pitched squeak that cracked in the middle of a syllable. Dr. Mitchell, I can explain everything. It is a massive misunderstanding. Dr. Mitchell ignored him and pressed the button on his radio. Security, this is the Chief of Medicine. I need a full detail in the main atrium immediately. Escort Bradley and his associate out of the building. He released the button and looked at Bradley with absolute withering contempt. You are not explaining anything to me, Dr. Mitchell stated, his words ringing like a gavel strike, finalizing a sentence. You are indefinitely suspended, effective immediately, pending a full forensic embezzlement investigation. Get out of my hospital. Two burly security guards in dark uniforms materialized from the adjacent corridor, their heavy boots thudding against the polished hospital linoleum. They flanked Bradley immediately, their hands hovering near their utility belts. Bradley shrank back, his bravado evaporating entirely. He looked like a deflated balloon, his shoulders slumping under the harsh fluorescent lighting. Hand over your security clearance, Bradley, Dr. Mitchell demanded, holding out an open, expectant palm. Your administrative access was revoked the exact moment the accounting department flagged the anomaly. We need the physical badge right now. Bradley's hands shook uncontrollably as he reached into his suit jacket pocket. He fumbled with the thick nylon lanyard, the plastic casing snapping loudly as he practically ripped it off his belt. He dropped the badge into Dr. Mitchell's palm, as if the plastic were burning his skin. The distinctive click of the badge changing hands echoed with absolute finality. Richard stepped forward, his face a mask of desperate corporate calculation. He had actively ignored his wife's public humiliation, but a highly publicized embezzlement scandal threatened his own bottom line. He smoothed his silk tie plastering on the slick artificial smile he reserved exclusively for high-stakes clients and damage control. "Let us not act hastily, Mitchell," Richard said, his voice lowering into a conspiratorial purr designed to diffuse tension. "We are all men of the world here. Administrative errors happen every day. Corporate funds get misrouted due to systemic glitches. There is absolutely no need to involve security or launch formal destructive investigations. I am certain we can handle this quietly. In fact, the board at the Oakwood Country Club is reviewing new memberships next week. I could personally guarantee your admission. A quiet resolution right here would be highly beneficial for everyone involved." Dr. Mitchell did not even blink. He looked at Richard with a mixture of profound pity and absolute unvarnished disdain. "You are offering me a golf club membership to cover up the theft of hospital resources?" Dr. Mitchell asked, his voice ringing with disbelief. "You really think this is a simple misrouted invoice?" Richard swallowed hard, his fake smile faltering. "It is a minor liquidity issue. I will cover the missing funds myself by tomorrow morning." Dr. Mitchell turned his gaze back to Bradley, who was actively trying to hide behind one of the imposing security guards. "Your son did not just overcharge a corporate expense account." "Richard," Dr. Mitchell stated, his words slicing through the atrium like a scalpel. "He bypassed the restricted financial firewalls and actively funneled money out of the Apex Pediatric Oncology Charity Fund. He diverted life-saving charitable donations directly into a shell account to pay the lease on a luxury downtown condominium." Amber gasped aggressively, covering her mouth with both hands. Even she looked utterly horrified by the specific source of her housing. She took a massive step away from Bradley, looking at him as if he were carrying a contagious disease. Brenda let out a small, pathetic whimper, clutching her designer purse to her chest. "You stole from sick children," she asked, her voice cracking under the weight of her son's depravity. "I did not know it was the charity fund," Bradley stammered, his eyes darting frantically toward the glass exit doors. The accounts were adjacent in the ledger. "It was a bridging loan. I was going to put it back after my quarterly bonus cleared. That money was earmarked specifically for the new pediatric seizure ward." Dr. Mitchell continued, his voice rising with righteous, undeniable fury. "The exact ward your own son is currently relying on upstairs to stay alive. An anonymous benefactor made a substantial private donation last month to upgrade our neurological monitoring equipment. You stole that exact donation to finance your mistress." I stepped out from behind Terrence, my posture rigid, my voice deadly calm. The pieces had finally clicked together. "It was not an anonymous benefactor, Bradley," I said, staring directly into his terrified, bloodshot eyes. "I made that donation." The silence that fell over the lobby was absolute and deafening. Bradley stared at me, his jaw completely slack, his breathing shallow and rapid. "You," Bradley whispered, shaking his head in frantic denial. "You do not have that kind of money. You are a data clerk." "I have exactly that kind of money," I replied, stepping closer, until I was mere inches from his pale, sweating face. "I used a fraction of my tech dividends to fund the hospital wing that is currently keeping our son alive. And you stole it to pay for a fake life with a woman who just threw you under the bus to save herself. You stole my money from your own child." The heavy revolving doors at the front of the hospital suddenly spun wildly open. Through the thick glass, the flashing red and blue lights of 2 Boston police cruisers illuminated the dark pavement outside. 4 uniformed officers stepped into the lobby, their heavy boots announcing their arrival as their radios crackled with static. They scanned the room, their eyes locking immediately onto the gathering crowd and the security guards flanking my husband. Bradley let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. He tried to scramble backward, but the security guards grabbed his arms, locking him firmly in place. Amber shrieked and immediately backed away, putting as much physical distance between herself and Bradley as the lobby allowed. She was already calculating her exit strategy. One of the police officers approached Dr. Mitchell, resting his hand casually on his duty belt. We received a call regarding felony embezzlement and corporate fraud at this location. Is this the suspect? Dr. Mitchell nodded sharply, gesturing toward Bradley. It is. We have the financial logs printed and ready for your review. The lead officer unclipped the heavy metal handcuffs from his belt. The metallic clinking sound echoed ominously. Bradley began to hyperventilate, his knees buckling as the reality of a prison cell loomed directly in front of him. He looked wildly at his parents, but Richard had turned his back and Brenda was weeping into her hands. I raised my hand, signaling the officer to stop. Not yet, I said, my voice carrying a sharp, undeniable authority that made the officer pause in his tracks. Terrence looked at me, a dangerous, knowing smile playing on his lips. He understood exactly what I was doing. He crossed his arms, ready to watch the execution. The officer frowned, looking confused by the interruption. Ma'am, we have a mandate to detain the suspect based on the hospital's formal complaint. I understand that, I replied smoothly, holding the officer's gaze with absolute confidence, but my husband has a very important social obligation to fulfill first. His parents are hosting their highly publicized 40th anniversary gala tomorrow night at the country club. The entire corporate elite of this city will be in attendance. The press will be there to document the event. Bradley looked up at me, tears streaming down his face. A mixture of profound relief and total confusion washed over him. He actually thought I was showing him mercy. He actually believed I was saving him from public ruin. I stepped close to him, dropping my voice to a lethal whisper that only he and his parents could hear clearly. Let him attend his parents' 40th anniversary gala tomorrow. I told the officers, my eyes locked on Bradley's terrified face. I want him to smile for the cameras first. The glaring green zeros reflecting off the dark plexiglass of the billing counter seemed to burn into the retinas of everyone close enough to witness the digital execution. Bradley stood perfectly still, his breath catching in his throat as he stared at his smartphone. His thumb frantically jabbed the screen, aggressively swiping downward to refresh the banking application. The loading circle spun for a torturous second, mocking him, before returning the exact same devastating result. Available balance $0.00. Amber let out a sharp, irritated huff, completely oblivious to the financial catastrophe unfolding in the palm of his hand. Stop playing games with your phone, Brad, she whined, tugging insistently at the sleeve of his tailored suit. Wire the dealership the money. Toby's ankle is throbbing. This hospital is depressing and I want my Porsche right now. Do not make me wait any longer. Bradley did not hear her. His eyes remained locked on the screen as the blood drained entirely from his face, leaving him with a sickly, ashen pallor. He blinked rapidly, his corporate arrogance dissolving into unadulterated panic. Slowly he lifted his head, his frantic gaze darting past Terrence and locking directly onto me. The confusion in his eyes rapidly mutated into a wild, cornered rage as he realized exactly who controlled the digital infrastructure of his life. What did you do? Bradley roared, his voice cracking with a high-pitched edge of hysteria. He shoved the phone roughly into his pocket and lunged forward, his hands outstretched as if he intended to grab me by the throat right there in the crowded emergency room lobby. Where is my money, Monica? Put it back right now. He moved with the blind, reckless momentum of a desperate man, but he never even made it within arm's reach. Terrence stepped effortlessly into the gap between us. He did not throw a punch or raise his voice. He simply planted his broad chest directly in Bradley's path and shoved him backward with a forceful, flat-palmed strike to the center of his sternum. Bradley stumbled, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly against the polished linoleum before he collided heavily with the edge of the billing desk. Keep your hands to yourself, Bradley. Terrence commanded, his deep voice slicing cleanly through the chaotic ambient noise of the room. You are already an accessory to the assault your mother just attempted. Do not add domestic violence to your rapidly growing list of legal failures today. Get out of my way, Terrence, Bradley spat, gripping the edge of the counter to steady his shaking legs. That crazy witch just hacked into my personal checking account and stole $90,000. I am calling the police. I am having her arrested for grand larceny right now. Brenda immediately seized the opportunity to screech from the sidelines, clutching the wrist Terrence had grabbed earlier. "Do it, Bradley. Call the authorities immediately. Have this pathetic woman dragged out of here in handcuffs. I always knew she was a scheming, greedy little parasite. She is probably funneling your hard-earned executive salary into some offshore account." I stood perfectly still, watching them unravel with absolute clinical detachment. I did not need to raise my voice or defend myself. I had brought the absolute best weapon to this fight, and he was currently unlatching his sleek leather briefcase on top of the hospital intake desk. Terrence calmly snapped the brass locks of his briefcase open. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, crisply folded stack of legal paper bound by a heavy blue seal. He held the document up under the harsh fluorescent lights, making sure Bradley, Brenda, and Richard got a crystal clear view of the prominent notary stamps on the front page. "You are not calling the police," Bradley Terrence said, a razor-sharp, predatory smile spreading across his face. "And nobody stole a single dime from you. You simply fell victim to your own monumental arrogance. Does this document look familiar to you, Richard?" A seasoned stockbroker who understood the lethal implications of blue-backed legal documents took a hesitant step forward. His face grew even paler as he read the bold lettering at the top of the page. "Let me refresh your memory." Terrence continued his voice, projecting with the practiced theatrical cadence of a trial lawyer commanding a courtroom. "5 years ago, you received your very first promotion to vice president. You were so incredibly proud of that shiny new salary. You were so terrified that your wife, who you repeatedly claimed was just wasting her time with a failing freelance data entry gig, would become a financial burden on your newfound wealth. You aggressively dragged Monica into my law office and forced her to sign a post-nuptial agreement to protect your precious assets." Megan let out a sharp gasp, staring at her brother with absolute disgust. "You forced your own wife to sign a post-nup because you got a promotion?" Megan asked, her voice shaking with revulsion. "He certainly did," Terrence confirmed, never taking his eyes off Bradley. "And he explicitly demanded that I draft the most ironclad, impenetrable separation of assets legally possible. He wanted a binding guarantee that Monica could never touch his executive bonuses, his retirement accounts, or his personal investments. He made her sit across from my desk and sign away her rights to his money while openly mocking her small business ambitions. I remembered that day perfectly. Bradley had thrown the pen at me across the mahogany desk, demanding I protect him from my own potential debts. He wanted absolute assurance that my late-night coding sessions would never impact his credit score. I knew exactly what I was doing when I signed that paper. While Bradley was busy building a picket fence to protect his low six-figure salary, I was silently using his own legal demands to construct an impenetrable fortress around a gold mine. He made sure any business I built would remain entirely my own, completely unaware that he was legally locking himself out of a billion-dollar empire. "That is marital property!" Brenda shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Richard, do something! She cannot just drain a joint account. A post-nup does not cover shared checking balances." "You are absolutely right," Brenda Terrence said smoothly, tapping the legal document against his palm. "Joint accounts are subject to shared division." But Bradley drained that joint account himself over the last 6 months. He spent thousands on luxury hotel suites, expensive dinners, and a very specific vintage emerald bracelet for his mistress. Every dime of Bradley's actual salary is already gone. You bled your own accounts dry trying to fund a double life you could not afford. Amber let out a strangled gasp, stepping away from the counter and staring at Bradley as if he had just transformed into a rotting corpse. "You are broke!" she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the walls. "You told me you were a millionaire!" "I am," Bradley stammered, sweat pouring down his forehead. "The $90,000 was right there this morning. I saw the transfer hit the account. It is my money. I saw it." Terrence smiled ruthlessly, leaning forward to deliver the final crushing blow. "It was never your money, Brad. The deposit you saw this morning was an automated corporate routing sweep. Under your own ironclad contract, all independent corporate dividends remain entirely separate. That $90,000 you thought was yours. It was Monica's tech dividends temporarily passing through the clearing account before settling into her private trust. You have exactly $12 to your name. The temporary reprieve I orchestrated with the Boston police was a highly calculated maneuver. Terrence had smoothly intervened, citing a procedural delay in the formal filing of the hospital's financial audit, ensuring Bradley walked out the glass doors without handcuffs. I needed him free for exactly 24 hours. I needed him to stand in the center of his parents' opulent anniversary gala, surrounded by the city's elite, completely oblivious to the guillotine poised directly above his neck. The hospital corridors had finally quieted into the hushed, sterile hum of the late-night shift. I sat alone at a small circular table in the corner of the staff cafeteria, a lukewarm cup of black coffee resting untouched between my hands. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly. Upstairs, Leo was sleeping soundly in the pediatric intensive care unit, heavily guarded by private security Terrence had discreetly arranged. My son was safe, but the war was far from over. The heavy metal door of the rear service elevator suddenly groaned open, the harsh squeal of ungreased hinges echoing across the empty cafeteria. I did not flinch, but my eyes darted toward the sound. Bradley slipped through the gap, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. He looked absolutely unrecognizable from the polished, arrogant executive who had commanded the atrium just hours earlier. His expensive suit jacket was gone, his silk tie hung loosely around his collar, and his shirt was severely wrinkled. His hair was plastered to his forehead with nervous sweat. He moved with the erratic, twitchy energy of a man completely cornered. He spotted me immediately. A flash of desperate malice crossed his face as he closed the distance between us, his heavy footsteps slapping against the linoleum. Before I could utter a single word, Bradley slammed a thick manila folder onto the center of my table. The sharp crack echoed through the cavernous room. "Sign it," Bradley commanded, his voice a ragged, breathless whisper. I looked down at the document resting on the formica surface. The bold black letters at the top of the page read Legal Medical Proxy and Emergency Fund Authorization. "What is this, Bradley?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. "You were permanently barred from this facility. If security finds you down here, they will drag you out by your hair." "I do not care about security," he hissed, leaning heavily onto the table until his face was inches from mine. "I need you to sign this proxy right now. It grants me joint administrative control over Leo's emergency health funds. The state offers a pediatric relief grant for terminal cases. I am activating it." I stared at him, the sheer audacity of his scheme crystallizing in my mind. He was completely broke, stripped of his salary, and locked out of my dividends. He had no way to pay Amber's demands, no way to flee the inevitable embezzlement charges, and no safety net. In his absolute desperation, he was trying to authorize a fraudulent emergency medical grant in our son's name so he could steal the payout and run. "You are trying to steal from a sick child to save yourself," I stated, the reality of his depravity settling like lead in my stomach. "You really have hit the absolute bottom. Sign the paper." Monica Bradley snarled, his fist slamming onto the table. "If you do not sign this authorization right now, I swear to God I will drag you through family court and destroy your life. I will declare you an unfit mother. I will file an emergency injunction to strip you of all parental rights." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. On what possible grounds? Bradley let out a cruel, breathless laugh. "You think a judge will favor a nobody data clerk who neglects her own child? I will bring up the second-grade spring pageant. Do you remember that Monica Leo was standing on that stage, dressed as a tree, crying because his mother was the only parent in the entire auditorium who failed to show up? I will tell the judge you abandoned your son when he needed you most." He thought that memory would break me. He thought weaponizing my deepest regret would force me into submission. Instead, it only hardened the ice in my veins. "I did not miss that play because I was neglectful, Bradley," I said, my voice dropping an octave, razor-sharp and unwavering. "I missed that play because I was working a double shift at the diner, followed immediately by a night shift entering medical data. I worked 20 hours straight that day to cover the minimum payments on the secret credit cards you maxed out. I was paying off the luxury watch you bought yourself and the weekend trips you took Amber on under the guise of corporate retreats. You stole my time with my son to fund your mistress. Do not ever bring up my dedication to Leo again." Bradley's eyes widened briefly. genuinely shocked that I possessed the exact financial receipts of his betrayal, but his panic quickly overrode his guilt. He did not care about the truth. He only cared about the exit strategy. "Nobody will believe you," he spat, thrusting a cheap plastic pen into my hand. "I am still a respected executive in this city. My family has influence. You are nothing. Sign the document, Monica. Give me access to the funds or I will make sure you never see Leo again. I will bury you in legal fees until you break." I looked at the pen in my hand, then at the medical proxy sitting innocently on the table. Bradley was so blinded by his own frantic greed that he had entirely failed to grasp the magnitude of the revelation in the lobby hours earlier. He had blocked out the reality of my wealth, convincing himself I was still the powerless woman he had abused for years. He thought this document was his ticket to freedom. He was handing a corporate authorization form to the undisputed owner of the very hospital network he was trying to defraud. I did not argue. I did not plead. I simply uncapped the pen and pulled the document toward me. "That is right." Bradley sneered, a sickening wave of relief washing over his sweaty face. "Do what you are told. It is the only thing you have ever been good at." I pressed the tip of the pen to the signature line. I did not sign with my standard hurried scrawl. With slow, deliberate, and flawless precision, I executed my full legally binding corporate signature. Every loop and curve was a nail in his coffin. I pushed the paper back across the table. Bradley snatched it up instantly, his hands shaking with greedy anticipation. He did not even glance at the ink on the page. He simply folded it in half, shoved it aggressively into his pants pocket, and backed away toward the service elevator. "You made the right choice, Monica." He breathed, a manic gleam in his eye. "Enjoy the gala tomorrow. It will be the last time you ever see me." He turned and fled the metal door, slamming shut behind him, leaving me alone in the quiet cafeteria. I took a slow sip of my black coffee. Bradley had just sprinted off with a document signed Monica, Chief Executive Officer, Apex Health Systems. The moment he presented that proxy to the state medical board, he would trigger an automatic, unassailable federal alert for corporate identity theft and wire fraud. He had not just secured his exit strategy, he had actively sealed his own doom. The last note of the cello hung in the air, vibrating against the crystal chandeliers, before dying completely. 300 of Boston's most influential socialites, politicians, and corporate titans turned their heads in absolute unison. The heavy oak doors of the country club ballroom remained pinned open by two uniformed valets, framing my entrance like a portrait of impending doom. I did not flinch under the weight of their collective stare. The custom-tailored emerald silk gown moved like liquid glass around my ankles, a stark contrast to the exhausted, overworked woman this family had spent years grinding into the dirt. Terrence stood immovable on my right, radiating the lethal calm of a predator, evaluating its territory. Dr. Mitchell stood on my left, his presence lending an undeniable, crushing medical authority to my arrival. Brenda was the first to recover from the collective paralysis. The champagne glass she had been holding trembled so violently that the expensive vintage spilled over the rim, dripping onto her heavily beaded bodice. Her face mottled into an ugly, uneven shade of crimson. She shot her arm out, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "Security!" Brenda screeched, her shrill voice shattering the stunned silence of the ballroom. "Security, remove this woman immediately! She is trespassing. She is an uninvited, deranged stalker. Get her out of my sight!" 4 burly private security guards in dark suits immediately detached themselves from the perimeter of the room, moving swiftly toward the entrance. They expected a hysterical, weeping ex-wife. They expected someone they could easily intimidate and drag out the back door. Terrence casually reached into his tailored jacket and produced a thick, laminated document bearing a silver holographic seal. He held it up just high enough for the lead guard to read the bold print. It was a federal injunction, signed and expedited by a superior court judge not 3 hours ago, granting me absolute legal access to the premises based on ongoing corporate fraud investigations linked directly to the estate. The lead guard stopped dead in his tracks. He held up a hand, signaling the other 3 men to stand down. They backed away, melting seamlessly into the shadows, leaving Brenda completely exposed and utterly powerless. I did not even look at my mother-in-law. I kept my eyes locked on the elevated stage at the far end of the ballroom where Bradley was currently standing frozen behind a crystal podium. He had been in the middle of preparing a toast. Now he looked like a man standing on the gallows watching the executioner pull the lever. I stepped forward. The crowd parted instantly, shifting away from me with the fluid, synchronized movement of a school of fish avoiding a shark. I walked with a slow, lethal grace, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished oak floorboards. The sound echoed through the silent room like the ticking of a bomb. Amber was standing near the front row of VIP tables, clutching a flute of champagne. As I passed her, her carefully constructed mask of high-class superiority crumbled into raw, unadulterated panic. She shrank back against the table, desperately trying to make herself invisible. Her eyes wide with the realization that the woman she had mocked just 24 hours earlier now held the power to destroy her entire existence. I did not give her the satisfaction of a glance. She was nothing more than collateral damage. I reached the base of the stage and glided up the carpeted steps, my gaze fixed exclusively on my husband. Bradley's knuckles were white as he gripped the edges of the podium, sweat beaded on his forehead, catching the glare of the stage lights. His chest heaved with shallow, erratic breaths. He was completely cornered, stripped of his security, his money, and his mother's protection. "Get off this stage," Monica Bradley whispered, his voice trembling as I stopped inches from him. "You are ruining everything. You are destroying my family's legacy." I leaned in close, so close I could smell the stale alcohol on his breath. "Your legacy is a lie, Bradley, and I am simply correcting the record." Desperation twisted his handsome features into something ugly and venomous. He thought he could still bully me into submission. He thought the old rules still applied. He leaned his face mere millimeters from my ear, dropping his voice to a vicious, guttural hiss meant only for me. "You are a pathetic, useless loser," Bradley spat, his words dripping with unmasked malice. "You come in here dressed like you matter, but you are nothing. You are a failure of a wife and a failure of a mother. You could not even keep your own son from getting sick. You are the reason Leo is dying in that hospital bed, and no amount of money is going to change the fact that you are a worthless, negligent." I did not pull away. I did not cry. I did not let his weaponized cruelty break me. Instead, I reached my hand up to the microphone stand separating us. With a swift, calculated flick of my index finger, I bypassed the mute switch on the soundboard control panel embedded in the podium. A sharp electronic whine pierced the air, signaling the microphone was fully active. I tapped the head of the microphone twice. The heavy, booming thuds echoed like cannon fire through the massive ballroom speakers. Bradley froze. He realized a fraction of a second too late what he had just done. The microphone had been live for the last 5 seconds. His vicious, unforgivable whisper accusing me of causing our son's terminal illness had just been amplified at maximum volume to 300 of the most powerful, influential people in Boston. The reaction was instantaneous. A collective gasp of pure horror rippled through the crowd. Women covered their mouths. Men stared in absolute disgusted shock. Megan, standing near the front, let out a strangled sob, burying her face in her hands. The room recoiled from Bradley, as if he had just transformed into a monster right before their eyes. His public persona, his carefully curated image of the grieving, dedicated father, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Bradley looked out at the sea of horrified faces, his jaw dropping open. The realization of his complete social annihilation struck him with physical force. He stumbled backward, releasing his grip on the podium, his legs trembling so violently he nearly fell off the stage. I smoothly closed the distance and took the microphone from the stand, holding it effortlessly in my hand. I looked out over the sea of silent, stunned guests. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice steady, clear, and projecting with absolute authority. "I apologize for the interruption, but as my husband so eloquently demonstrated, there are some family matters that require immediate public clarification." Behind me, the massive wall-to-wall projector screen was currently cycling through a saccharine, softly lit slideshow of Brenda and Richard's 40 years of marriage. Pictures of smiling family vacations, Ribbon-cutting ceremonies and fake staged perfection glowed brightly in the dim room. I pulled my smartphone from the hidden pocket of my gown. I did not look back. I simply kept my eyes on the crowd holding Brenda's horrified, bulging stare. I pressed a single button on my screen. The romantic string music accompanying the slideshow cut out with a harsh electronic screech. The projector glitched the screen, flashing bright blue for a split second before the image resolved. The slideshow of Brenda's picture-perfect marriage vanished entirely. In its place, illuminating the ballroom in stark, unforgiving high definition, was a massive high-resolution image of a property deed. The collective breath of 300 elite guests left the ballroom in a single echoing rush. Above my head, the 40-foot projector screen illuminated the opulent space, not with a nostalgic montage of a 40-year marriage, but with the stark black-and-white reality of a legally binding property deed. The intricate seal of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts sat heavy in the top right corner. Brenda's champagne flute finally slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the polished oak floor with a sharp crash. The glass shattered, splashing vintage Dom Perignon across the hems of nearby designer gowns, but not a single guest looked down. Every pair of eyes in the room was completely glued to the massive document hovering above the stage. I stood holding the microphone, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch out for exactly 10 seconds. I wanted them to read the fine print. I wanted the reality to sink into the marrow of their bones. 3 years ago, I began my voice amplified and echoing off the vaulted ceiling, projecting with a calm, surgical precision. 3 years ago, this very estate went into absolute, irreversible foreclosure. A wave of shocked murmurs immediately rippled through the sea of socialites and corporate executives. Brenda physically staggered backward, her hands flying to her pearl necklace. "That is a fabricated lie," Richard roared, finding his voice before his wife could. He lunged forward from his VIP table, his face flushing a deep, dangerous purple. "Turn that screen off right now. Security, cut the power to that projector. This woman is a deranged, bitter ex-wife trying to ruin a private celebration." Nobody moved to the power switches. The security guards, having already seen Terrence's federal injunction, remained firmly planted in the shadows. "There is no lie on that screen, Richard," I countered, my voice cutting through his panic like a blade. "You built a 40-year reputation on the illusion of generational wealth and untouchable success. But behind closed doors, you were completely hollowed out. You gambled away your entire executive retirement fund on highly leveraged offshore day trading. You lost every single dime of your liquid assets. And when the banks finally came to collect the collateral, they came for this sprawling historic country estate." The whispers in the crowd grew louder, sharper. I could see the city's elite leaning in their polite society masks, slipping to reveal pure, unadulterated, scandalized greed. They were watching the king and queen of Boston high society being stripped naked. "You were exactly 48 hours away from the bank chaining the front gates and throwing you onto the street," I continued, pacing slowly across the stage. But then a miracle happened. An anonymous corporate buyer swooped in at the 11th hour. They paid off your massive defaulted mortgages in full, purchased the estate directly from the holding bank, and generously allowed you to stay in the home. They set up a private lease agreement so you could save face in front of all these lovely people here tonight. I pointed down at Brenda, who was currently clutching the edge of a banquet table to keep from collapsing. "You have been paying rent to a holding company for 3 years, Brenda," I stated, enunciating every syllable. "You do not own this estate. You do not own the ground you are standing on. You are a tenant putting on a masquerade ball in a house you lost." "Shut your mouth!" Richard bellowed, spit flying from his lips as he shoved past a waiter. "Do not listen to a word she says. It is a complete fabrication. We own this property free and clear. She is doctoring documents to exact revenge because my son finally threw her out. I demand you step down from that stage immediately before I have you arrested for criminal defamation." He turned to the crowd, raising his hands in a desperate, sweating plea. "My friends, my colleagues, you know me. You know my family. Do you really believe this hysterical woman over 40 years of our pristine track record? Richard's desperate attempt to rally the room was cut brutally short by the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps walking up the center aisle. Terence stepped forward, emerging from the periphery where he had been quietly waiting. He did not look like a man engaging in an argument. He looked like a grim reaper carrying the receipts. In his hands he held a thick stack of glossy-bound legal portfolios. He did not say a word to Richard. Instead, Terence stopped at the very front row of VIP tables, the tables specifically reserved for the hospital board members, the country club president, and the city's top investors. With a swift, practiced motion, Terence began distributing the portfolios directly into the hands of Richard's most valuable high-net-worth friends. "I highly recommend turning to page 4, Terence announced, his deep voice carrying easily over the rising din of the ballroom. "You will find the official bank foreclosure notices complete with Mr. Richard's original signature of default. On page 7, you will find the complete purchase agreement transferring ownership of the estate to the private holding company. And on page 10, you will find the monthly rental receipts Mrs. Brenda has been signing for 36 consecutive months." The sound of pages turning echoed loudly in the front row. The country club president, a man who had just an hour ago toasted to Richard's enduring financial brilliance, put on his reading glasses. He stared at the documents in his hands, his mouth falling open. He looked up at Richard, his expression morphing into absolute frigid disgust. "Richard," the man asked, his voice ringing out in the quiet room, "is this true? Is your name on this default notice?" Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at the hard, undeniable evidence clutched in the hands of his peers. The illusion was dead. The silence of his peers was far more deafening than any scream. I raised the microphone back to my lips, drawing every eye in the room back to the stage and the massive screen behind me. "You spent years calling me a pathetic loser, Brenda," I said, staring directly down at my mother-in-law, who was now weeping silently, her perfect makeup running down her face. "You told Amber I was a useless nobody, a low-class data entry clerk who brought zero value to your elite family. You sneered at me while actively living inside a house that someone else bought to save you from complete destitution." I tapped the remote in my hand once more. The image on the massive projector screen shifted, zooming in on the bottom right corner of the property deed. The text magnified until the buyer's corporate signature line was larger than life, impossible for anyone in the room to ignore. "Read the name of the corporate buyer, Brenda," I commanded, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "Read the name of the entity that owns the walls around you, the floor beneath you, and the roof over your head." Brenda slowly lifted her tear-streaked face. She stared at the giant screen, her lips moving silently as she read the bold, undeniable print. "Apex Health Systems." I read aloud for her, letting the words strike her like a physical blow. "That is my company. That is the tech dividend you thought was useless. That is the gold mine Bradley legally locked himself out of. I am the anonymous buyer." I took one step to the very edge of the stage, towering over the shattered remains of the Boston elite. "I am your landlord, Brenda." I stated the finality of the sentence, freezing the blood in her veins. "And because Bradley decided to try and fraudulently access my corporate emergency funds this afternoon, the auto draft for your lease payment bounced. You are officially 24 hours behind on your eviction notice." The sheer gravitational pull of my words dragged the remaining air out of the ballroom. Brenda's knees finally buckled. She did not faint with the delicate grace of a high society matriarch. She collapsed into a messy, sobbing heap against the edge of the velvet-draped table, her manicured hands clawing desperately at the tablecloth. Richard stood completely paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, the foreclosure documents trembling violently in his grip. On the stage, Bradley looked as though he had been physically gutted. His eyes darted wildly across the room, searching for a single sympathetic face among the hundreds of Boston elites. He found absolutely none. The silence was toxic, thick with the overwhelming stench of ruined reputations. Then the sharp, aggressive sound of a stiletto heel snapping against the polished oak floor broke the spell. "Amber." She had been standing near the front row of VIP tables, clutching her champagne flute like a life preserver. I watched the mental arithmetic register behind her heavily contoured eyes. She looked from the eviction notice projected on the 40-foot screen down to Richard's trembling hands, and finally up to the sweating, pathetic shell of the man she had been sleeping with. The mansion was a rental. The executive salary was gone. The secret accounts had been drained to absolute zero. Bradley was not a millionaire trapped in a loveless marriage. He was a penniless fraud about to face federal embezzlement charges, and his family was 24 hours away from being thrown onto the street. Bradley stumbled down the carpeted stage steps, his hand reaching out toward her in a desperate plea for an ally. "Amber," he choked out, his voice cracking with panic. "Amber, please do not look at me like that. We can fix this." He reached out and grabbed her arm. She reacted with violent revulsion. Amber violently yanked her arm away from him, her sharp acrylic nails digging into his wrist as she shoved him backward with surprising force. "Get your filthy hands off me!" Amber shrieked, her voice stripping away every single ounce of the refined, high-class persona she had spent the last 2 years perfecting. The shrill, nasal pitch echoed through the cavernous ballroom, causing several guests in the front row to physically wince and step back. "Fix this!" Amber mocked, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. "Fix what, Bradley? You have exactly $12 in your checking account. Your parents do not even own the house they sleep in. You are completely broke." Bradley held up his hands, his face pale with terror, desperately trying to shush her in front of the city's most influential investors and socialites. "Amber, keep your voice down," he begged in a frantic whisper. "Everyone is staring at us." "Let them stare," she screamed, stepping directly into his personal space. "You lied to me. You told me she was a worthless nobody. You promised me millions, Bradley. You swore to me that this miserable charade was almost over." She turned and pointed a manicured finger directly at me, though her furious gaze remained locked on Bradley. "You looked me in the eye in our hotel suite and promised me that her life insurance policy would pay out by the end of the year. You said the relentless stress of the pediatric bills and working double shifts would trigger a heart attack, or the exhaustion would make her crash her car. You said all we had to do was wait for her to drop dead." A collective horrified gasp rippled through the entire ballroom. The crowd of executives and politicians recoiled as if a biological weapon had just been dropped in the center of the room. The absolute depravity of their scheme hung heavily under the crystal chandeliers. Bradley had not just been stealing from me. He had actively banked on the relentless stress of working 20-hour days to fund his mistress and care for our sick son, to literally kill me. He had been waiting for me to die. Amber was completely unhinged now, fueled by the staggering realization that her entire financial future had evaporated into thin air. She did not care that she was confessing to a conspiracy in front of 300 witnesses. She only cared that she had been scammed. "You told me you secretly doubled her life insurance coverage 3 months ago," Amber yelled, her voice breaking with hysterical rage. "You said we would take the $5 million death benefit and move to the Maldives. You promised me a private island, you lying, pathetic fraud." Dr. Mitchell shifted on his feet, his jaw tight with medical outrage as he realized the sheer level of psychological and physical abuse his patient's mother had been subjected to. Terrence stepped smoothly to my side, his eyes locked on Bradley, with the cold, lethal calculation of a prosecutor planning an attempted murder trial. Bradley opened his mouth, stammering, trying to form a coherent sentence, trying to deny the horrifying plot his own mistress had just broadcast to the entire room. "Amber, stop, you are hysterical," he pleaded, his voice reduced to a pathetic, wavering whine. "You do not know what you are saying." Amber simply sneered at him, her lips curling in absolute disgust. She raised her crystal champagne flute, stepping forward so he could not evade her. She hurled the contents directly into his face. The expensive vintage splashed violently across his eyes, dripping down his nose and soaking instantly into the collar of his ruined, wrinkled dress shirt. Bradley gasped, squeezing his eyes shut as the alcohol stung his face. "You broke loser!" Amber shrieked, slamming the empty crystal glass onto a nearby banquet table with a loud crack. She turned on her heel and stormed down the center aisle. She shoved aggressively past a stunned state senator and marched directly out the heavy oak doors. She did not look back once, leaving Bradley standing perfectly still in the center of the room, dripping with champagne, isolated and utterly humiliated under the harsh glare of the stage lights. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind Amber, sealing the echoing finality of her exit. Bradley stood completely paralyzed under the harsh stage lighting, expensive vintage champagne dripping from his chin, soaking into his collar, and pooling darkly on the polished floorboards. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. It was a suffocating vacuum where 300 of the city's most influential people collectively held their breath, watching the total public annihilation of the golden boy they had revered just moments ago. Brenda's manicured hands shook violently against the velvet tablecloth. Her eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for any remaining shred of authority in a kingdom that had just been burned to ash. She bypassed her ruined husband, who was still staring blankly at the foreclosure documents in his hands, and zeroed in on the one person she had controlled her entire life. Megan. Brenda shrieked, the sound sharp, desperate, and entirely devoid of its usual aristocratic polish. "What are you doing just standing there like an idiot? Tell your husband to do his job. Terrence is a lawyer. Have him call the real authorities right now. Help your brother. Throw this lying parasite out of our anniversary gala immediately." Megan flinched. It was an automatic reflex, a deeply ingrained physical response to 30 years of relentless maternal conditioning. She looked at her mother, panic-stricken and commanding. She looked at Bradley, dripping and humiliated on the stage. Then she looked up at Terrence. Her husband stood tall beside me, his broad shoulders squared, radiating a calm, protective strength. Terrence did not push her or issue a countercommand. He simply met her gaze and gave a single solid nod, offering her the silent courage she had always been denied. Megan swallowed hard, her trembling hands slowly balled into fists at her sides, the knuckles turning white. "No, Mother," Megan said. Her voice started out shaking, but it carried clearly across the silent, cavernous room, gaining strength with every syllable. "I am not doing that. And neither is Terrence." Brenda gasped, clutching her beaded chest as if she had been physically struck by a heavy blow. "Excuse me. You will do exactly as I say. You will defend your blood. If you do not get this deranged woman out of my sight this instant, I will disown you, Megan. I will call the estate lawyers tomorrow morning and write you completely out of the family will. You will not see a single dime of our money." A short, bitter laugh escaped Megan's lips. It started small, a breathy sound of pure disbelief, and grew into a resonant sound of absolute liberation. "What money?" Mother Megan asked, taking a deliberate step forward away from the VIP table. "The money Dad gambled away on the stock market 3 years ago. The money Bradley stole from his own sick child to fund a mistress who just dumped him in front of the entire city. You are threatening to cut me out of a will that is as bankrupt as this family's morality." Brenda's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The threat she had wielded like a weapon for decades had just been shattered in front of her high society peers. "You held that fake inheritance over my head my entire life." Megan continued her words, slicing cleanly through the opulent ballroom. "You forced me to study what you wanted to wear, what you dictated, and to smile for your wealthy friends, always promising that my blind obedience would secure my future. You made me look down on Monica because she actually worked for a living while we were sitting in a rented mansion pretending to be royalty. Keep your non-existent will. I would rather live in absolute poverty than spend another second participating in your toxic, pathetic lies." Megan did not wait for her mother's response, nor did she look at her father. She turned her back on the head table entirely. With her head held high, she walked deliberately across the open floor, her heels clicking against the oak in a steady, victorious rhythm. She climbed the short carpeted stairs and stopped directly behind me, standing shoulder to shoulder with Terrence. She had definitively chosen her side. Bradley watched his sister defect, his bloodshot eyes wide with a frantic, uncomprehending horror. He looked at his sobbing mother, his paralyzed father, the empty double doors where his mistress had fled, and the 300 guests staring at him with undisguised revulsion. Every single pillar of his arrogant existence had been systematically kicked out from under him. He had no wealth, No corporate status, no family loyalty, and no escape route. The illusion was dead. Something inside Bradley's mind audibly snapped. A primal, guttural roar ripped from his throat, a terrifying sound, completely stripped of all his corporate refinement. His face twisted into a red mottled mask of pure rabid hatred. He locked his eyes on me, blaming me entirely for the absolute destruction of his fraudulent reality. With a violent kick, he shattered the crystal podium, sending the heavy acrylic crashing onto the stage floor in a shower of sharp splinters. "I will kill you!" Bradley screamed, launching himself blindly off the edge of the stage. He moved with the reckless, uncoordinated momentum of a cornered animal. His hands were outstretched like claws aimed directly at my throat, his face contorted in murderous rage. I did not even have time to brace for the impact. Terrence moved faster than my eyes could track. He stepped seamlessly into Bradley's path, interposing his solid frame between me and my unhinged husband, intercepting his flight midair. Terrence caught Bradley by the lapels of his ruined dress shirt and the leather belt of his trousers, absorbing the attack and using Bradley's own desperate momentum against him. With a powerful fluid twist of his entire torso, Terrence redirected my husband's trajectory. Bradley flew sideways through the air. He slammed violently into the massive, intricately carved swan ice sculpture anchoring the center of the main catering table. The heavy block of ice shattered on impact with a deafening crack, sending hundreds of jagged frozen shards and gallons of freezing water crashing down onto Bradley, burying him under the glittering, ruined wreckage. Bradley lay gasping among the jagged, melting ruins of the swan. Freezing water pooled around him, soaking his custom-tailored suit, while shards of ice glittered maliciously in the harsh stage lights. He looked less like a corporate titan and more like a drowned, pathetic rat. Terrence simply adjusted his cuffs, standing like an impenetrable fortress between me and the wreckage, his face entirely unbothered. The high society guests were completely paralyzed, trapped in a breathless hush, unable to comprehend the sheer velocity of the destruction they were witnessing. Then the tall, arched windows of the ballroom lit up. The pristine darkness of the estate grounds was violently sliced apart by the relentless strobing flash of red and blue lights. The harsh neon colors swept across the crystal chandeliers, casting frantic, erratic shadows over the horrified faces of the Boston elite. The heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open with a resounding thud. A squad of uniformed police officers marched inside their heavy boots, thudding against the polished floorboards. Leading them was a tall, stern-faced detective in a beige trench coat. He did not look impressed by the velvet drapes, the towering floral arrangements, or the designer gowns. He looked like a man with a job to do. The sea of socialites parted instantly, scrambling over each other to clear a path. Nobody wanted to be caught in the blast radius. I promised the detective I would only take 10 minutes of his time. I announced, my voice amplified by the microphone ringing out over the approaching sirens. I just needed to finalize my eviction notice. "Detective, the floor is yours." The detective stepped up to the shattered ice sculpture and looked down at my husband. "Bradley, you are under arrest for grand larceny, wire fraud, and the embezzlement of over $2 million from the Apex Health Systems Pediatric Charity Fund. You have the right to remain silent." Two uniformed officers hauled Bradley to his feet. He shivered violently, slipping on the wet floor as they wrenched his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic ratcheting of the handcuffs locking into place echoed sharply through the room. Bradley wept openly, begging his father to call their lawyers, begging for someone to make this stop. Richard took a sudden, cowardly step backward, raising his hands as if to physically block his son from his vision. "Do not look at me," Richard shouted, his voice trembling with self-preservation. "I have absolutely nothing to do with this. You brought this disgrace upon yourself, Bradley. Officer, take him out of here. He is a criminal." The detective did not turn back toward the doors. Instead, he pivoted slowly on his heel, locking his cold gaze directly onto Richard. He reached inside his trench coat and pulled out a second thick manila folder. "Actually," Richard the detective stated, his voice booming with undeniable authority, "you are going exactly where he is. You are also under arrest." Richard froze, the remaining color draining from his face until he looked like a ghost. Brenda let out a strangled gasp, clutching her throat as if she were suffocating. "That is impossible," Richard stammered, backing into a catering table, sending silver serving trays clattering to the floor. "I am a respected investor. I have not stolen anything." "You did not steal the money, Richard. You just cleaned it," the detective countered, closing the distance between them. "We have spent the last 3 days auditing your supposedly defunct holding company. The consulting firm you claimed went bankrupt 3 years ago has been highly active. You used that fake corporate entity to systematically launder the exact funds your son was siphoning out of the pediatric charity. You created fake vendor invoices, funneled the stolen charity money through your offshore accounts, and brought it back into the country as clean consulting revenue to pay the rent on this leased estate." The murmurs in the room exploded into outright shouts of disbelief. The father and son had conspired to rob sick children just to maintain the illusion of their generational wealth. It was a level of absolute, unforgivable greed that even the ruthless corporate sharks in the room could not stomach. 2 more officers stepped forward, grabbing Richard by the shoulders. He tried to pull away his expensive shoes, scuffing against the floor, but the officers easily overpowered him. The cold steel cuffs snapped onto his wrists, pulling his arms behind his back in a brutal display of finality. The sharp click of the locking mechanism seemed to break something deep inside Richard. The mask of the stoic, untouchable patriarch completely shattered. He twisted wildly in the officer's grip, his eyes bulging as he glared at his wife. "This is your fault!" Richard screamed, spitting the words at Brenda with a rabid, unhinged fury. He strained against the handcuffs, his face turning a dangerous mottled purple. "Tell them, Brenda. Tell them why I had to do it." Brenda physically recoiled, her hands flying to her pearl necklace. "Richard, have you lost your mind? Stop talking immediately." "I will not go down for you," he roared, completely ignoring the officers pulling him toward the center aisle. "You bled me dry. You knew the stock market wiped out our retirement, but you refused to cancel your country club memberships. You refused to stop taking first-class trips to Paris. You refused to stop buying $50,000 designer bags. You told me you would divorce me and humiliate me in front of all these people if I forced you to live like a commoner. I only washed that stolen money because your pathetic, relentless shopping addiction demanded it." The entire ballroom watched in horrified fascination as the pristine 40-year marriage of Boston's most elite couple instantly disintegrated into a toxic bloodbath. "You miserable, impotent failure of a man!" Brenda shrieked back, all of her refined elegance vanishing in a flash of vicious survival instinct. She lunged forward, pointing a shaking finger inches from his face. "Do not you dare blame me for your utter incompetence. A real man provides for his family. A real man does not lose his entire fortune day trading like a reckless amateur. You are a weak, pathetic parasite, and you always have been." "You are a greedy, shallow leech," Richard bellowed over his shoulder, as the police forcefully dragged him down the aisle toward the flashing lights. "You are nothing without my name. Enjoy living in the gutter where you belong. I hope you rot in a federal cell," Brenda screamed after him, her voice cracking into a hysterical, ugly sob. She stood alone among the overturned chairs and shattered glass, her kingdom fully reduced to ruins. The harsh, humming fluorescent lights of the precinct holding room offered zero flattering angles. It was a stark, brutal contrast to the crystal chandeliers that had illuminated Bradley's downfall less than 12 hours ago. The air tasted of industrial bleach and stale desperation. I sat in a dented metal chair, folding my hands neatly on the scarred surface of the interrogation table. The heavy steel door groaned open. A weary correctional officer escorted Bradley into the room, unlocking his handcuffs before stepping outside and letting the door slam shut. Bradley did not look like the heir to a Boston real estate empire. He looked like a man who had spent the night shivering on a thin plastic mattress. His designer trousers were heavily creased, and his expensive dress shirt was still stained with the sticky, dried residue of Amber's thrown champagne. His hair stuck up at odd angles, and the arrogant, entitled sneer that usually dominated his features had been completely erased, replaced by a hollow, sunken terror. He collapsed into the metal chair across from me. He immediately buried his face in his hands and began to weep. It was a loud, wet, pathetic sound completely devoid of any real dignity. Monica, he choked out, looking up at me with bloodshot, pleading eyes. Thank God you came. You have to get me out of here. The food, the smell, the people in that cell block. It is a nightmare. You have to pay my bail. You own Apex Health Systems now. You have millions in liquid capital. Please wire the bail money. I cannot spend another night in this place. I sat perfectly still, letting his frantic begging hit the walls and slide down into nothingness. I did not blink. I did not offer a comforting word. I was out of my mind, Monica, he continued, reaching across the table in an attempt to grab my hands. I pulled them back, resting them securely in my lap. He swallowed hard, adjusting his strategy, shifting from panic to profound remorse. I got caught up in the pressure. My father forced me into those offshore accounts. He made me funnel that pediatric charity money. I was trying to protect our family. I was trying to secure a future for Leo. At the sound of our son's name in his mouth, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I swear to you, Bradley pressed on, leaning forward, attempting to force sincerity into his bloodshot eyes. If you bail me out, I will change. I will check into rehab. I will go to marriage counseling. I will be a real husband to you. More importantly, I will be a real father to Leo. I will be there for every hospital visit, every bedtime story. Just give me one more chance to be the dad he deserves. I reached into the leather portfolio resting beside me. I did not pull out a checkbook. I did not pull out a bail bond agreement. I pulled out a single glossy 8x10 photograph and slid it face up across the scratched metal table. Bradley's frantic monologue died instantly in his throat. He stared down at the image, the remaining color draining rapidly from his face. The photograph was incredibly clear. It showed Bradley standing on the pristine manicured green of the Oak Haven Country Club. He was wearing a crisp white polo shirt, caught mid-swing, with a 9-iron grinning widely at a joke someone off camera had just made. The time and date stamp in the bottom right corner burned in bright red text. October 14th, 2:30 in the afternoon. That was a Tuesday, I said, my voice cutting through the stale air like a scalpel. It was exactly 3 months ago. Do you remember what else happened on October 14th, Bradley? He swallowed hard, unable to look away from the photograph, unable to meet my eyes. Let me refresh your memory, I continued, leaning forward, forcing him to hear every single syllable. That was the day I had a mandatory meeting with the hospital board to secure funding for Leo's specialized treatment. I asked you to do exactly one thing. I asked you to pick up your sick, immunocompromised 5-year-old son from kindergarten at noon. You told me you were locked in a critical executive board meeting. You told me you could not leave the office under any circumstances. I tapped the glossy surface of the photograph with my index finger. You were playing the back nine with your frat brothers, I stated, the cold fury rising in my chest. You turned off your phone so you would not be disturbed on the golf course. You left Leo waiting on the curb outside his school. It started pouring freezing rain at 1 o'clock. By the time the school principal finally managed to reach my office at 3, Leo had been standing in the freezing downpour for 3 solid hours. He was shivering so violently his lips were blue. That afternoon triggered a severe respiratory infection that put him in the intensive care unit for a week. Bradley opened his mouth, stammering, searching desperately for a lie that could cover the undeniable truth resting on the table. Monica. I can explain. My phone died. The client insisted on a round of golf. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute lethal authority in my tone made him flinch. You paid for that exclusive country club membership using the exact charity funds you stole from Leo's pediatric ward. You stole money meant to save your son's life so you could play golf while he stood freezing in the rain. Do not ever use the words "real father" in my presence again. I reached into my portfolio a second time. I extracted a thick stack of legal documents bound with a heavy blue clip. I placed them directly on top of the golf photograph. The bold black lettering across the top page was impossible to miss. Absolute relinquishment of parental rights and final decree of divorce. There is no negotiation here, Bradley, I instructed, pulling a heavy black pen from my pocket and placing it directly over the signature line. You are going to sign these papers right now. You are granting me full, uncontested legal and physical custody of Leo. You are waiving any right to visitation, alimony, or claim to my corporate assets. You are signing yourself completely out of our lives." Bradley stared at the documents, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. "I will not sign that," he shot back, a fleeting spark of his old arrogance attempting to resurface. "You cannot force me to give up my son. I will fight you in court. I will tell the judge you are extorting me." I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out a small metallic silver rectangle. I set the encrypted flash drive on the table next to the pen. "This drive contains the complete unedited ledger of your offshore accounts," I stated, watching his brief flash of arrogance instantly evaporate into pure terror. "It contains every fraudulent wire transfer, every fake invoice your father created, and the exact routing numbers you used to pay your mistress. The local police currently have enough to hold you for embezzlement. But if I hand this drive over to the FBI Financial Crimes Division, you will not just face state charges. You will face decades in a federal penitentiary." I pushed the pen 1 inch closer to his trembling hand. "Sign these now, or I hand the FBI the encrypted hard drive containing your offshore accounts." The towering glass atrium of the Apex Health Systems headquarters was a monument to clinical precision and modern power. The morning rain lashed against the 40-foot floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, weeping shadows across the pristine Italian marble floor. The lobby buzzed with the quiet, efficient energy of top-tier executives, software engineers, and medical tech developers moving purposely through the security turnstiles. Then the heavy revolving doors at the main entrance ground to a halt. Brenda stumbled into the pristine cathedral of my corporate domain. She was entirely unrecognizable from the arrogant, diamond-draped society matriarch who had tried to dictate my life just 24 hours prior. Her heavily sprayed hair had collapsed into wet, stringy clumps plastered to her cheeks. She was not wearing cashmere or custom Chanel. She wore a cheap, soaked trench coat over wrinkled slacks. Behind her, she dragged a single scuffed suitcase. The faux leather was peeling violently at the corners, and the broken plastic wheels squealed with a hideous, high-pitched scratching sound that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. She marched unsteadily toward the elevated front security desk. The chief receptionist, a sharply dressed woman named Sarah, looked up with professional detachment. "I need to see the CEO," Brenda demanded, her voice cracking, lacking its usual aristocratic bite. "I need to see Monica. I am her mother-in-law. Call her down here right this instant." Sarah did not blink. She checked her digital manifest with calm efficiency. "I apologize, ma'am, but our CEO does not take unannounced visitors. If you would like to schedule an appointment with her executive assistant, I can provide you with the contact information." "Do not give me the runaround, you glorified secretary!" Brenda shrieked, slamming her wet hands onto the polished granite counter. The sudden shrill outburst caused several passing executives to freeze in their tracks. "I am her family. My husband has been falsely arrested. The federal government seized our bank accounts this morning. The bank padlocked the gates of my estate. I have absolutely nowhere to go. Tell her to come down here right now." Sarah pressed a hidden button under the desk, signaling the lobby security detail. "I will have to ask you to lower your voice, ma'am, or I will have you escorted from the premises." Brenda's brief flash of entitlement completely shattered. The reality of her destitute situation crashed over her. In a display of sheer, pathetic manipulation, Brenda dropped her dignity entirely. She collapsed onto her knees on the cold marble floor. She clamped her hands together in a desperate theatrical prayer motion. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the rain, and ruining her mascara, sending dark, muddy rivers down her cheeks. "Please," she wailed loudly, ensuring she had the attention of the gathering crowd of employees. "Please do not throw me out. I am a grandmother. I just want to see my grandson. I am Leo's grandmother. Family is supposed to help family. I have nothing left. I am begging you." The soft melodic chime of the private executive elevator cut cleanly through Brenda's hysterical sobbing. The brushed steel doors parted smoothly. I stepped out into the lobby. I wore a tailored charcoal suit projecting an aura of absolute untouchable authority. Terrence walked exactly 2 paces behind me, a silent, imposing shadow. The murmuring crowd of employees instantly parted, clearing a wide path for me as I walked toward the front desk. I stopped 10 feet away from where Brenda was kneeling on the floor. She looked up, her bloodshot eyes widening with frantic hope as she spotted me. Monica. She choked out, crawling forward on her knees, desperately reaching out toward the hem of my trousers. Monica, thank God. You have to help me. Richard is in a holding cell. The lawyers will not even return my calls because my credit cards are frozen. I have absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back. I did not step back. I looked down at her with a gaze devoid of any human warmth. I know we had our differences, Brenda sobbed, putting a hand to her chest. But I am still family. I love my grandson. I just want to be part of little Leo's life. I can help you raise him now that Bradley is gone. A boy needs his grandmother. Please just let me stay with you. I will do anything. I reached into the pocket of my blazer. I did not pull out a checkbook. I did not offer her a hand up from the cold floor. I pulled out my sleek black smartphone. With a single deliberate tap, I synced my device directly to the lobby's high-fidelity public address system. I pressed play. The audio file broadcasted clearly and loudly from the hidden speakers scattered across the cavernous lobby. It was Brenda's voice recorded just 2 months ago during a phone call with Bradley. Her tone on the recording was completely stripped of the weeping, grandmotherly affection she was currently performing. It was laced with unmistakable aristocratic disgust. You need to put your foot down with Monica Bradley. The recorded? Brenda sneered, her voice echoing off the glass walls. That child is a defective burden. He is constantly sick, and it completely ruins your vibe. You are a rising executive. You cannot be shackled to a weak kid and a stressed-out wife. Send him to a specialized facility and tell Monica to get over it. The recording clicked off. The absolute heavy silence that followed was lethal. Every single employee in the lobby stared at Brenda with naked, unadulterated revulsion. The grand matriarch routine had been completely vaporized in front of my entire company. Brenda remained frozen on her knees. Her mouth hung open in silent horror. The fake tears had instantly stopped flowing. She stared up at me, realizing the terrifying depth of the surveillance I had maintained on her toxic family. You never viewed my son as your family. Brenda, I stated, my voice echoing clearly across the silent lobby. You viewed him as a defective burden. You viewed him as an inconvenience to your son's social climbing. You actively lobbied to lock my sick 5-year-old child in an institution so you could maintain your pristine country club illusion. You have absolutely no family standing in this building. I did not wait for her to formulate a lie. I shifted my gaze to the 2 imposing security guards flanking the main entrance. I gave them a single sharp nod. The guards stepped forward immediately. They hauled Brenda to her feet by her elbows, ignoring her sudden frantic thrashing. She did not have the strength to fight them. She was completely hollowed out, her manipulative spirit broken by the undeniable public playback of her own cruelty. The guards marched her swiftly toward the revolving doors. They shoved her out onto the wet, unforgiving sidewalk. One of the guards grabbed the peeling knockoff suitcase and tossed it out after her. The heavy glass doors sealed shut with a firm click, locking out the cold air. Brenda was left sitting completely alone on the wet concrete curb, shivering violently in the freezing rain, entirely erased from the world she had once tried to rule. The rain, lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive suite, offered a fitting backdrop to the absolute silence I demanded in my office. I had barely taken my seat behind the polished mahogany desk, the image of Brenda shivering on the wet pavement still fresh in my mind, when my encrypted private terminal chimed with a high-priority alert. The subject line was completely devoid of corporate etiquette. It simply read Apex's Golden Boy price tag, $500,000. I clicked the secure icon. A dozen high-resolution image files flooded my secondary monitor. They were highly compromising, grotesque shots of Bradley in a squalid motel room. He was surrounded by illegal narcotics, surrounded by questionable company, and looking completely unhinged. The accompanying message was short, arrogant, and entirely desperate. I know you threw Bradley out, but his name is still tied to Apex Health Systems. If you do not want the hospital board and your major investors seeing what your pathetic ex-husband does in his free time, you will wire $500,000 to the attached offshore routing number or drop a duffel bag of cash at a location I choose. You have exactly 1 hour. Amber. A cold, humorless smile touched the corners of my mouth. Amber had completely miscalculated her target. She assumed I cared about Bradley's lingering public relations shadow. She assumed I operated out of fear. Most fatally, she assumed she was hiding behind an impenetrable digital wall. She had absolutely no idea who she was threatening. Before I took over Apex Health Systems, I built my career as a senior data architect. My specialty was dismantling encrypted corporate networks and exposing hidden digital liabilities. Amber had used a commercial proxy server routing her email through a fake IP address in Switzerland, assuming that would keep her safe. It was child's play. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. I bypassed her cheap firewall in less than 15 seconds. I isolated the email's metadata, extracting the raw origin packet. She had stripped the EXIF data from the photos, but she had forgotten to scrub the digital signature of the device that actually sent the message. I pulled the MAC address of her smartphone, ran a quick traceroute protocol, and watched the digital hops bounce from Switzerland to New York, and finally right back to downtown Boston. Got her, I stated, not taking my eyes off the cascading lines of code. She is pinging off a public Wi-Fi router. The IP address belongs to the Sterling Cafe, exactly 4 blocks from this building. She is sitting right down the street. Terrence leaned over my shoulder, his eyes scanning the data pulling up on the screen. He did not ask how I had localized a phantom signal in under 60 seconds. He simply went to work. "Give me that MAC address," Terrence instructed, pulling out his own encrypted tablet. "Let us see who we are really dealing with." Terrence tapped into the deep background databases he maintained for his private security firm. He bypassed the social media fluff and went straight for federal and state registries. The search engine spun for a moment before spitting out a heavily redacted file. Terrence hit a bypass command, flooding the screen with red alert banners. "Her legal name is Amanda Vance Terrence," said his voice, dropping into a low, dangerous register. "And she is not just a gold-digging mistress. She is a highly wanted fugitive." I turned my chair, giving the screen my full attention. "She has active, unbailable felony warrants in Nevada and Ohio." Terrence continued, rapidly scrolling through the rap sheet. "Extortion, wire fraud, and severe child support fraud. She has spent the last 4 years falsifying paternity tests to drain bank accounts from multiple wealthy men." But here is the sickest part. She has a 6-year-old son named Toby. She kidnapped him from his biological father in Ohio, a decent, hardworking schoolteacher who has spent his entire life savings fighting for custody. She uses the boy as a prop to extort her targets, moving across state lines whenever the authorities get too close. A profound, icy disgust settled over me. Amber had paraded that child around Bradley, using Toby to validate her demands for a luxury lifestyle, all while an innocent father was desperately searching for his missing son. "Call the federal marshals," I commanded, turning back to my keyboard. "Tell them we have an exact location on Amanda Vance. I will make sure she stays put." I opened a reply window to Amber's extortion email and typed a single decisive response. "I do not deal in wire transfers. I have your cash. Meet me at the Sterling Cafe in 20 minutes. Look for the black duffel bag." I hit send, closed the laptop, and stood up. 10 minutes later, the atmosphere inside the Sterling Cafe was thick with the smell of roasted espresso and the quiet murmur of morning commuters dodging the rain. Amber sat in a corner booth facing the door. She wore oversized designer sunglasses indoors, sipping a matcha latte with a smug, victorious posture. She was compulsively checking her expensive watch, waiting for her payday to walk through the door. She was so focused on looking for a woman carrying a duffel bag that she completely failed to notice the 2 massive, broad-shouldered men in tactical windbreakers entering through the side door. They did not order coffee. They moved with terrifying, coordinated precision, flanking Amber's booth before she even registered their presence. Amanda Vance, the taller man, stated, his voice a low, unmistakable boom of federal authority. Amber flinched, her sunglasses sliding down the bridge of her nose. "Excuse me," she stammered, frantically looking toward the front entrance. "I think you have the wrong person." My name is Amber. The second marshal reached down, grabbing her wrists with lightning speed and hauling her forcefully to her feet. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked into place with a sharp, brutal finality. You have active felony warrants in 2 states for extortion fraud and custodial interference, the marshal stated, completely ignoring her sudden, panicked thrashing. You are under arrest. I am waiting for someone, Amber shrieked, kicking wildly at the cafe table, knocking her expensive latte onto the floor. I have a meeting. You cannot do this. Let me go. The bell above the cafe entrance chimed. I stepped through the doors, shaking the rain from my umbrella. I walked slowly toward the corner booth, stopping just inches from where the marshals had Amber pinned against the wall. She stopped thrashing the second she made eye contact with me. She looked down at my empty hands, the horrifying realization crashing over her. There was no duffel bag. There was no $500,000 payout. There was only a trap. You set me up, Amber hissed, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure hatred. You stupid, arrogant woman. When Bradley finds out you sent me to jail, he will destroy you. Bradley is currently rotting in a holding cell directly across the city, I replied, my voice perfectly level, slicing through her manic delusion. And you are not going to jail for blackmailing him. You are going to federal prison for using an innocent child as a hostage. Amber's breath hitched, her bravado shattered, replaced by a desperate maternal panic she had never once shown before. Toby, she gasped, pulling violently against the handcuffs. Where is my son? What did you do to him? I looked her dead in the eye, delivering the final crushing blow. He is exactly where he belongs, I stated. Child Protective Services intercepted Toby at your luxury hotel 15 minutes ago. They already contacted his biological father in Ohio. He is boarding a flight to Boston right now to finally bring his son home. You are never going to use that child as a weapon ever again. The courtroom layout was aggressively bleak. Heavy wood paneling stretched up toward high-arched windows where the Boston rain beat a dull, relentless rhythm against the thick glass. The gallery was completely packed with rows of reporters, eager photographers, and disgraced high society associates who had turned up solely to watch the final permanent execution of the family's once untouchable reputation. Bradley sat at the defense table, his neck straining against the coarse collar of a standard-issue orange jail jumpsuit. His wrists were locked in heavy steel chains that clinked loudly against the wooden table whenever his hands shook. Behind him, Richard sat perfectly rigid, his face a pale, static mask of aristocratic shock, his own chained hands resting heavily on his lap. The defense attorney stood up, straightening his tailored suit before adjusting the microphone on his podium. Your Honor, we ask for maximum leniency regarding my client, Bradley, the lawyer argued, casting a dramatic look toward the judge's bench. Bradley has spent his entire life under immense, unyielding psychological pressure. He was systematically driven to financial desperation and a temporary lapse in sanity by the calculated actions of his overbearing, cold-hearted wife. Monica played the role of a humble, dependent spouse while secretly accumulating billions in assets under Apex Health Systems. She deliberately concealed her staggering wealth to trap my client, to manipulate his family, and to engineer their absolute ruin for her own personal vindication. Bradley was a victim of psychological warfare in his own home. Bradley immediately seized on his attorney's narrative. He leaned forward into his defense desk microphone, squeezing his eyes shut to force a sudden, desperate display of tears. It is the truth, Your Honor. Bradley choked out his voice, cracking dramatically as he looked up at the judge's bench. Monica completely emasculated me. She hoarded her success, watched me struggle to keep our family afloat, and refused to provide the necessary support for our home. She treated me like an outsider in my own life. I was pushed into a corner by a secret billionaire who wanted nothing more than to see my family destroyed. The embezzlement from the charity was a chaotic, desperate attempt to regain some control over my existence. I wanted to protect my son. I was not in my right mind because of the toxic environment she created. I sat perfectly still on the prosecutor's side of the room, my posture flawless, my face an unreadable fortress of calm. I did not flinch at his pathetic attempt to gaslight the court. I did not launch into an emotional outburst. Beside me, Terrence did not look up from his digital display. He simply tapped the tablet screen twice, sending a data command to the courtroom's large media projectors. "Your Honor," Terrence said, his deep baritone voice effortlessly slicing through Bradley's manufactured sobbing. "My name is Terrence, and as special prosecutor representing the hospital board and the victimized children of the Apex charity, I believe the defense's narrative requires an immediate confrontation with empirical evidence." Terrence stepped out from behind our desk, moving with the fluid, commanding confidence of a master litigator. He did not waste words on rhetoric. He went straight to the raw data. The defense claims Bradley acted out of a desperate desire to protect his family. Terrence stated, gesturing to the massive screens on the courtroom walls. "Let us audit his actual definition of family duty." The monitors flickered to life, displaying a time-stamped video file from October 14th. The security camera footage was from the pediatric ward of St. Jude's Medical Center. The digital clock in the corner of the video read exactly 1:15 in the afternoon. The gallery leaned forward collectively. Bradley's eyes widened with a sudden paralyzing horror as he recognized the hallway. This footage was captured on the exact afternoon our son Leo suffered a critical cardiovascular event. Terrence explained, his voice entirely devoid of pity. "I know from my thorough review of the hospital's admission logs that Bradley had been paged 7 separate times by the emergency staff. He was explicitly told that his 5-year-old son was struggling to breathe." The video showed a younger version of Bradley walking down the hospital corridor. He was not rushing. He was dressed in a pristine golf polo, holding an expensive leather designer bag in his left hand. As he passed the glass double doors of the intensive care isolation room, a monitor alarm could be seen flashing red inside. Through the glass, a nurse was actively trying to stabilize a convulsing little boy. Bradley did not stop. He did not even turn his head toward the glass. He walked right past his seizing son, his eyes locked entirely on his smartphone screen as he typed a message. Terrence clicked his remote, zooming the camera filter directly into the glass reflection across the hall. Bradley was heading toward the elevators. Terrence noted his words dropping like heavy weights into the silent courtroom. He was not checking on Leo. He was walking directly to the executive parking garage to pick up his mistress Amber, using a luxury vehicle purchased with $300,000 of stolen pediatric charity funds. This is the man who claims he was driven to temporary insanity by a cold wife. This is the man who claims he embezzled to protect his home. The courtroom fell into an absolute suffocating silence. The reporters were typing furiously, their fingers flying across laptops as the myth of Bradley's victimhood was systematically ground into ash. Bradley's mother, Brenda, let out a pathetic, muffled gasp from the back row of the gallery, her manicured hand flying to her mouth as she watched her golden boy's definitive execution on camera. The judge, a stern, sharp-eyed woman with 30 years of bench experience, stared down at the defense table with undisguised revulsion. She closed her ledger with a resounding thud that echoed like a gunshot through the room. "I have heard quite enough," the judge stated, her voice icy and final. "Mr. Wilson, your attempt to weaponize your own child's medical crisis to evade accountability is one of the most abhorrent displays of moral bankruptcy this court has ever witnessed. You did not steal out of desperation. You stole out of unadulterated parasitic greed." She looked toward the clerk, pulling the sentencing guidelines forward. "Regarding Richard Wilson for the charge of systematic money laundering through fraudulent corporate entities, I sentence you to the maximum penalty of 15 years in a federal penitentiary," the judge declared. Richard didn't move. He simply sank back into his chair, his jaw hanging loose, as the reality of his 40-year empire's absolute termination settled over him. Regarding Bradley Wilson, the judge continued, her gaze locking onto my shivering husband. "For grand larceny, wire fraud, and the intentional exploitation of a pediatric medical charity, you are sentenced to the maximum term of 25 years, without the possibility of early parole." A guttural, choked gasp left Bradley's throat. The guards immediately stepped forward, grabbing his orange-clad shoulders and wrenching him up from his seat. The heavy leg irons rattled aggressively against the floorboards as they turned him toward the rear exit doors. Before he crossed the threshold, Bradley twisted wildly in their grip. He looked back across the courtroom, his eyes locking onto me with a desperate, frantic terror. "Monica, please!" he screamed, his voice bouncing pathetically off the high ceiling. "Do not do this to me." I did not offer him a single glance. I simply adjusted my blazer, turned my back on his screaming form, and walked smoothly through the heavy double doors into the fresh morning air, leaving his ruined family entirely in the past. Exactly 30 days after those heavy courtroom doors sealed Bradley's fate, a different set of doors parted for me. The automatic glass entrance of St. Jude's Medical Center slid open with a soft, welcoming hum. The last time I stood in this bustling lobby, I was a terrified, desperate mother pleading for someone to save my dying son, while a corrupt protocol blocked his care. Today, the dynamic was entirely rewritten. I was not returning to beg for a miracle. I was returning to buy the building. I bypassed the crowded visitor elevators and walked with deliberate, measured steps toward the executive wing on the top floor. I wore a sharp, navy blue tailored suit that projected an aura of absolute, untouchable authority. Terrence walked a half step behind me, carrying a sleek, locked titanium briefcase. The hospital's board of directors waited nervously around a sprawling mahogany table inside the primary conference room. These were the same wealthy administrators who had once bowed to Richard Wilson's empty threats, compromising their medical ethics for country club prestige and golf course handshakes. Now they stood up immediately as I entered the room, projecting an aura of fearful deference to the CEO of Apex Health Systems. I took my seat at the head of the table. I did not engage in pleasantries or offer polite corporate smiles. Terrence set the briefcase on the polished wood, clicked the latches open, and slid a heavy bound legal contract across the table. "This is the Apex Pediatric Mega Grant," I stated, my voice ringing with crystalline authority. "It is a full, unrestricted cash endowment. It will double the physical footprint of your pediatric intensive care unit, upgrade all cardiovascular surgical suites with state-of-the-art robotic technology, and fully fund your top-tier residency program for the next decade." The chief medical administrator stared at the figures on the first page, his hands trembling slightly. It was a sum of money that would secure the hospital's status as a premier global institution. He reached eagerly for a silver pen, but before the ink could touch the paper, I placed my hand firmly over the signature line. "There is a single non-negotiable stipulation attached to this capital," I added, my gaze locking onto the chief administrator with lethal intensity. "You will permanently eradicate the VIP priority loophole. Medical necessity and strict triage protocols will dictate patient care in this building without exception. No sick child will ever be bumped down a surgical waiting list because a wealthy donor or a loud executive demands preferential treatment. If I discover a single violation of this policy, if I find out that money has superseded medicine in this facility, Apex Health Systems will strip this funding overnight and bankrupt your board. Do we have an absolute understanding?" The board members nodded instantly, a ripple of frantic, breathless agreement circling the mahogany table. The administrator signed the document with eager, sweeping strokes. I countered with my own signature, officially securing a future where no mother would ever have to experience the helpless terror I had endured. Leaving the stifling atmosphere of the boardroom behind, I took the private elevator down to the newly designated pediatric recovery wing. The sharp clinical smell of antiseptic was masked by the bright, colorful murals painted along the wide corridors. Then I heard it. The sound was bright, melodic, and completely perfect. It was the sound of a healthy child laughing. I stepped out of the elevator bay and looked down the gleaming hospital corridor. Leo was running. The pale, fragile boy who had once fought for every shallow breath in a sterile isolation room was entirely gone. He was not confined to a bed entangled in intravenous wires or struggling against a failing heart. His cheeks were flushed with a healthy, vibrant pink, and his eyes were bright with mischievous energy. He wore a pair of light-up sneakers that flashed with every rapid, heavy step he took against the linoleum floor. "Mommy!" he yelled, spotting me at the end of the hall. He sprinted toward me, completely unhindered by the cardiovascular condition that had once threatened to steal his life. Before he could reach my open arms, Terrence stepped smoothly into the hallway from a nearby nurse's station, intercepting the boy with a booming, joyful laugh. The giant security expert scooped Leo up effortlessly, swinging him high into the air as the boy shrieked with pure, unadulterated delight. Megan stood nearby, holding a stack of coloring books and a shiny superhero balloon, grinning widely at the scene. She reached up and tickled Leo's side as Terrence spun him around, causing the boy to kick his legs in a fit of giggles. Watching them, a profound, undeniable warmth settled over my chest. This was what real family looked like. It was not defined by toxic bloodlines, inherited wealth, or manipulative aristocratic obligations. It was forged in loyalty, protected by fierce truth, and defined by the people who stood fiercely by you when the world was falling apart. Terrence and Megan had fought for my son's life when his own father had walked away to pamper a mistress. They were his family now. I left them playing in the corridor, stepping away for a quiet moment. I walked toward the end of the hall, stopping by a massive floor-to-ceiling window that offered a sweeping panoramic view of the Boston skyline. The heavy rain and gloom from the previous month had finally cleared, leaving behind a crisp, brilliant blue sky. The city stretched out below me, looking alive and full of endless, untapped potential. Deep inside my designer leather bag, my smartphone buzzed with a harsh, vibrating rhythm. I pulled the device out and looked at the screen. The caller ID displayed an automated prompt from a high-security state penitentiary. It was a collect call. Bradley was allowed one phone call a week from his cell block, and he was using his only lifeline to desperately reach out to the woman he had completely underestimated. I did not feel a single trace of anger looking at his name. I did not feel the lingering sting of betrayal, nor did I feel any passing pity for the miserable reality he now faced. Looking at the flashing screen, I felt absolutely nothing at all. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I pressed my thumb against the cool glass of the screen, selecting the block caller option with a single definitive tap. The buzzing ceased, instantly replaced by peaceful, unbroken silence. I dropped the phone back into my bag and looked out over the sunlit skyline. The ultimate revenge was never about destroying the people who hurt you. It was about rendering them entirely irrelevant. It was about moving forward unburdened and untouchable into a brilliant, untethered life where the villains simply no longer existed. The most profound lesson from these stories is that your inherent value is never dictated by the toxic expectations of your biological relatives. True security and happiness come from building an independent life and finding a chosen family who genuinely supports you during your darkest moments. When faced with profound betrayal, the ultimate victory is not seeking petty revenge against those who hurt you. Instead, true justice is reclaiming your narrative and thriving entirely on your own terms. Never let anyone diminish your success. Share your experience of walking away from toxic relatives to find peace. Please comment below.